You keep suffering because a quiet part of you is still waiting for what hurt you to return. Not because it was good for you, not because it gave you peace, but because it became familiar, and the mind will often choose familiar pain over unknown freedom. Maybe you still hope they will come back different, softer, kinder, ready to explain everything, ready to love you the way you once begged to be loved. Maybe you still replay the old moments, searching for proof that it meant something, that it was not all pain, that there is still a hidden ending where everything becomes beautiful again. But this is where suffering begins, because hope can become a chain when it is tied to something that already broke you. Buddhist wisdom teaches that pain is part of life, but suffering grows when the heart refuses to release what has already changed. Everything that enters your life is temporary. People change, feelings fade, seasons end. And when you keep reaching for what has already left, you begin living inside a memory instead of living inside the present moment. Tonight, these lessons will help you see the truth with softer eyes. You will begin to understand why your heart keeps holding on, why your mind keeps returning to the same wound, and why peace cannot enter a hand that is still closed around the past. Slowly, something inside you will loosen, the waiting will become weaker, the fantasy will lose its power, and your soul will remember that what left was not the end of your life. This is not just a lesson about letting go. This is the beginning of freedom from the hope that keeps hurting you. Are you ready? Let's begin. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that the pain is no longer coming from what happened. It is coming from the part of you that keeps returning to it, long after the person leaves, long after the betrayal ends, long after the moment has passed. The mind still revisits it like an old house it cannot stop entering. Not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. And this is where the next truth begins to reveal itself. The human mind does not always choose peace. Very often it chooses what it already knows, even when what it knows is suffering. There is a strange comfort in familiar pain. A painful relationship can feel safer than loneliness. Disappointment can feel easier than uncertainty. Even heartbreak can begin to feel like home when you have lived inside it for too long. This is why so many people secretly stay emotionally attached to what destroyed them. They are not only attached to the person or the memory, they are attached to the emotional pattern itself. The Buddhist teachings speak deeply about attachment, but one thing many people never realize is that attachment is not always about pleasure. Sometimes people become attached to suffering because suffering becomes emotionally predictable. The mind begins to trust what is familiar more than what is healthy. And once this happens, letting go no longer feels like freedom. It feels like losing a part of yourself. This is the hidden addiction to emotional familiarity. A person can spend years trapped inside emotional cycles without understanding why they cannot move on. They tell themselves they miss the person. They tell themselves they are searching for closure. They tell themselves they are waiting for one final conversation. But often, what they are really craving is emotional familiarity. Their nervous system became used to that emotional environment, even if it was painful. This happens because the brain is constantly trying to create certainty. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with the unknown. The unknown feels dangerous to the mind. Even unhealthy situations can begin to feel emotionally safe simply because they are predictable. If someone spent years feeling ignored, abandoned, criticized, or emotionally unstable in a relationship, those emotional states can become normalized inside the body. Eventually, peace itself begins to feel unfamiliar. This is why some people leave toxic relationships and then suddenly feel empty when life becomes calm. Silence feels strange. Stability feels boring. Healthy love feels suspicious. Kindness feels unnatural. Not because they truly want pain, but because their mind has been conditioned to expect emotional chaos. The Buddha understood this long before modern psychology existed. He taught that the mind clings to patterns because it fears impermanence. The mind would rather repeat familiar suffering than face uncertain freedom. This is one reason people return to the same relationships over and over again. They are not simply choosing another person, they are choosing emotional familiarity. You can see this everywhere in human life. Some people repeatedly choose emotionally unavailable partners. Some repeatedly chase people who reject them. Some constantly recreate abandonment. Others repeatedly stay in friendships where they are unseen, unappreciated, or emotionally drained. On the surface, it appears irrational, but underneath, the mind is trying to return to what feels emotionally known. The deepest addictions are not always physical. Many are emotional. A person can become addicted to longing, addicted to waiting, addicted to fixing broken people, addicted to emotional instability, addicted to chasing approval from people who never fully give it. Over time, these emotional patterns stop feeling painful and start feeling normal. And this is where suffering becomes dangerous, because once pain feels normal, healing begins to feel uncomfortable. A peaceful life may sound beautiful in theory, but to someone conditioned by emotional chaos, peace can initially feel empty. They may unconsciously create drama because stillness feels unfamiliar. They may reopen old wounds because emotional intensity makes them feel alive again. The mind confuses emotional stimulation with emotional connection. This is why many people revisit old messages, old pictures, old memories, and old conversations, even when they know it hurts them. They are not only searching for the person, they are searching for the emotional state they became addicted to. The strange thing about emotional familiarity is that it disguises itself as love. People often say, "I cannot let go because I loved them too much." But sometimes the deeper truth is, I cannot let go because my identity became attached to the emotional experience. The suffering became woven into the self. The pain became part of the routine. The longing became part of daily life. Without it, they no longer know who they are. This is why letting go can feel terrifying. It is not simply the loss of a person. It feels like the loss of emotional identity. If someone spent years emotionally attached to another person, their thoughts, emotions, routines, fantasies, and sense of self may have slowly wrapped around that attachment. Once the relationship ends, they feel emotionally disoriented. This is why the mind keeps returning to the pain. It is trying to rebuild a familiar emotional structure. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment creates illusion. The illusion says, without this person, I cannot be whole. The illusion says, without this pain, I will lose myself. But the deeper truth is that clinging is what keeps the suffering alive. A wound cannot fully close if the mind keeps reopening it every day. And many people reopen their wounds constantly without realizing it. Every replayed memory becomes another emotional re-injury. Every fantasy about reconciliation becomes another refusal to accept reality. Every mental conversation with the past keeps the attachment breathing. The mind does this because it believes emotional attachment protects it from loss. But in reality, attachment often prolongs the loss indefinitely. One of the hardest truths to accept is that the body remembers emotional pain, even when the conscious mind wants to move on. This is why people can logically understand that someone was unhealthy for them while still emotionally craving them deeply. The nervous system became trained to associate that person with emotional survival. Intermittent affection creates especially deep attachment. When love and pain arrive unpredictably together, the mind becomes obsessed. Moments of affection feel more valuable because they are inconsistent. This creates emotional dependency. The person begins chasing emotional relief the same way a thirsty person chases water. This is not weakness, it is conditioning. The Buddhist path does not teach self-hatred for attachment. It teaches awareness of attachment. There is a major difference. Many people judge themselves for not being able to let go. They become angry at themselves for still missing someone. But shame only deepens suffering. Healing begins with honest observation. You begin by noticing the pattern without attacking yourself for having it. You begin noticing how often your mind returns to the same memories. You begin noticing how your emotions rise and fall based on thoughts of the past. You begin noticing how loneliness suddenly makes old attachments appear more beautiful than they really were. This awareness changes everything, because once you see the pattern clearly, the illusion begins weakening. You begin realizing that much of your suffering is not coming from the present moment. It is coming from mental repetition. The event happened once, but the mind keeps reliving it thousands of times. This is why Buddhism places such deep importance on presence. Presence interrupts emotional repetition. The present moment is often far less painful than the mind's endless relationship with the past. But most people avoid the present moment because the present moment feels empty after attachment ends. They mistake emptiness for failure. They panic when life becomes quiet. Yet Buddhism teaches that emptiness is not punishment. Emptiness is space. It is the space where new life eventually grows. But first, the addiction to emotional familiarity must be understood. If someone spent years emotionally chasing unavailable love, healthy love may initially feel strange. If someone spent years surviving chaos, peace may feel emotionally flat at first. This does not mean peace is wrong. It means the nervous system has not yet learned safety outside suffering. Healing requires retraining the mind and body to stop romanticizing familiar pain. This process takes patience. There will be days when the past suddenly feels irresistible again. A song may reopen memories. A lonely night may make old attachments feel stronger. A random memory may suddenly pull you backward emotionally. This does not mean you are failing. It means the old emotional pathways are still active. Every human mind forms habits. Emotional habits are no different. The more you revisit painful attachments mentally, the stronger those emotional pathways become. But the opposite is also true. Every time you stop feeding the attachment, the emotional grip weakens slightly. Every time you return your awareness to the present moment, the mind slowly learns a new way of existing. This is why Buddhist practice emphasizes observation without attachment. You observe the craving without obeying it. You observe the loneliness without panicking. You observe the sadness without becoming consumed by it. Slowly, the mind learns that emotions can rise and fall without controlling your life. One of the greatest mistakes people make is believing that healing means never thinking about the past again. That is not realistic. Healing means the past no longer controls your inner state. The memories may still exist, but they stop ruling your emotional world. And eventually something beautiful begins happening. The emotional intensity weakens. The memories stop feeling sacred. The fantasies lose their grip. The person you once thought you could never survive without slowly becomes smaller inside your mind. Not because they never mattered, but because your attachment to suffering begins dissolving. This is true freedom. Freedom is not pretending nothing hurt you. Freedom is no longer needing the pain to maintain your emotional identity. Many people secretly fear healing because suffering became familiar company. The pain gave them something to focus on. The longing gave them emotional purpose. Letting go feels like stepping into emotional emptiness, but the emptiness is temporary. Beyond that emptiness is peace. Beyond that peace is clarity. And beyond that clarity is the realization that life was never asking you to keep carrying the wound forever. The Buddha taught that clinging creates suffering because reality itself is always changing. Trying to emotionally freeze the past is like trying to stop a river with your hands. Life continues moving whether the mind accepts it or not. The more tightly you grip what already ended, the more pain you create for yourself. And this is why emotional familiarity becomes so dangerous. It tricks people into believing that pain is safer than freedom. It convinces them to keep revisiting what already wounded them because the unknown feels frightening. But growth always begins inside uncertainty. You cannot discover peace while constantly returning to emotional prisons that feel familiar. You cannot build a new life while emotionally worshipping old pain. And you cannot fully heal while secretly hoping suffering will return in a different form and finally save you. At some point, the mind must stop chasing emotional familiarity and begin choosing truth instead. The truth may hurt initially. The truth may feel empty at first. The truth may force you to face loneliness, grief, and uncertainty. But the truth also opens the door to liberation. Because once you stop feeding familiar suffering, the nervous system slowly begins learning something it may have forgotten long ago. Safety, stillness, presence, peace. And perhaps for the first time in a very long time, you begin understanding that healing was never about getting the past back. It was about finally becoming free from needing it. And this is where many people become trapped without realizing it. After the mind grows attached to familiar suffering, it begins creating one final illusion to keep the attachment alive. That illusion is hope, not healthy hope, not the kind that inspires growth or healing, but the kind that quietly chains the heart to what already betrayed it, the kind that whispers, maybe one day they will come back, maybe one day they will finally understand your pain. Maybe one day everything will become what you hoped it would be. And without noticing it, hope slowly becomes emotional imprisonment. There is a very painful kind of hope that keeps people emotionally frozen for years. It does not look dangerous at first. In fact, it often disguises itself as love, loyalty, faith, or emotional strength. But underneath, it quietly prevents healing from happening, because part of the mind is still waiting for the thing that destroyed its peace to suddenly become the thing that saves it. This is one of the deepest forms of suffering after betrayal. The betrayal itself hurts deeply, but what often hurts longer is the hope that refuses to die afterward. The mind keeps creating emotional futures where the person returns changed, wiser, softer, remorseful, finally capable of giving the love they once withheld. And every time this fantasy is replayed, attachment continues breathing. This is why some people remain emotionally trapped long after the relationship has ended. Their body may have moved on physically, but emotionally they are still standing at the same closed door, hoping it will reopen one day. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment does not only cling to people, it clings to expectations, imagined futures, emotional fantasies, and unfinished desires. Betrayal becomes especially painful because it destroys not only trust, but the future the mind secretly built around another person. When someone betrays you, the pain is rarely only about what happened. It is also about the future you thought you were walking toward together. The mind grieves conversations that never happened, memories that were never created, moments that never arrived. In many ways, betrayal forces people to mourn imaginary lives that existed only inside hope. And this is why hope can become a prison, because the mind keeps emotionally living inside futures that reality already destroyed. A person may know logically that someone was dishonest, emotionally unavailable, manipulative, or destructive, yet still secretly hope for their return. This creates deep internal conflict. One part of the mind sees reality clearly, while another part keeps feeding emotional fantasy. This internal contradiction creates exhaustion. The heart cannot fully heal while still emotionally negotiating with the past. Many people think healing means waiting long enough for the pain to disappear, but true healing often begins when false hope finally collapses. As long as the mind secretly believes reconciliation is necessary for peace, suffering continues quietly underneath everything else. This is why people constantly search for signs after betrayal. They analyze social media posts. They reread old conversations. They look for hidden meanings in small interactions. They replay memories, trying to find proof that the connection was real enough to return someday. Hope transforms ordinary things into emotional evidence. A simple message becomes a sign. A random memory becomes destiny. A dream becomes emotional confirmation. The mind does this because accepting finality feels unbearable at first. Finality forces the ego to face reality without fantasy protecting it, and reality can feel brutally painful when attachment has been strong. The Buddha taught that suffering grows when the mind resists reality. Betrayal becomes unbearable not only because someone hurt you, but because the mind keeps arguing with what already happened. It says, "This should not have ended. They should have loved me differently. Things should have turned out another way." But reality does not bend to emotional desire. And this is where attachment disguises itself as hope. Healthy hope allows life to move forward. Unhealthy hope keeps life emotionally frozen. One creates freedom, the other creates waiting. Many people spend years waiting emotionally without realizing it. They continue living externally, going to work, talking to people, smiling in public, but internally they remain emotionally paused. A hidden part of them still waits for a message, an apology, a return, or a moment of emotional redemption. This kind of hope slowly drains life force because emotionally the person never fully leaves the past behind. Part of their energy remains attached to what betrayed them. Buddhism teaches that attention is energy. Wherever the mind continuously returns, emotional energy flows. This means that constantly feeding false hope keeps emotional attachment alive. The mind becomes trapped in repetitive emotional cycles instead of opening itself to the present moment. And over time, this emotional waiting creates deep suffering. The nervous system stays tense. The mind becomes obsessed with possibilities. Peace feels impossible because emotionally the heart is still waiting for a future that may never come. What makes this especially painful is that hope often feels morally beautiful. Society praises people who never give up. Movies romanticize waiting. Songs glorify emotional longing. People are taught that holding on proves love is real. But Buddhism asks a different question. At what point does holding on become self-destruction? At what point does hope stop being healing and start becoming emotional imprisonment? These questions are uncomfortable because they force people to confront how attachment disguises itself. The mind often avoids reality by calling its attachment hope. But many times what people call hope is actually fear of letting go. Because letting go means accepting uncertainty. Letting go means accepting that some endings are permanent. Letting go means facing life without the emotional fantasy that once gave comfort. And for many people, fantasy feels safer than grief. Fantasy temporarily protects the heart from loss. It allows the mind to avoid accepting painful truths fully. But over time, fantasy quietly deepens suffering because reality remains unchanged underneath it. This is why some people stay emotionally attached to unavailable people for decades. They become addicted to possibility instead of reality. The emotional fantasy becomes more important than what truly exists. They stop loving the real person and start loving the imagined version created by hope. This imagined version is dangerous because it prevents emotional clarity. The mind edits memories selectively. It remembers tenderness while minimizing cruelty. It remembers potential while ignoring patterns. It remembers promises while overlooking actions. Hope paints over reality, and betrayal becomes even more painful when the mind refuses to see clearly. The Buddhist path is not about becoming cold or hopeless. It is about seeing reality without illusion. True peace requires honesty, not the honesty of bitterness, but the honesty of clarity. Clarity says, "This hurt me." Clarity says, "I wanted something different." Clarity says, "I cannot force another person to become who I hoped they would be." And most importantly, clarity says, "My peace cannot depend on someone else's return." This realization is incredibly painful at first, because the ego wants emotional rescue. It wants the person who caused the wound to also become the source of healing. But this often keeps suffering alive indefinitely. Many people secretly believe closure can only come from the person who betrayed them. They wait for explanations. They wait for remorse. They wait for accountability. But Buddhism teaches that waiting for another person to free your mind gives them continued control over your inner peace. Freedom begins when you stop emotionally asking the past for permission to heal. This does not mean the grief disappears instantly. Grief still comes in waves. Some nights still feel unbearably heavy. Certain memories still reopen the heart unexpectedly. But something slowly changes once false hope begins dissolving. The emotional obsession weakens. The nervous system relaxes slightly. The mind stops constantly searching for signs. And for the first time, emotional energy slowly returns to the present moment instead of remaining trapped inside fantasy. This process is not easy because betrayal damages trust deeply. After betrayal, many people become emotionally split. One side wants to release everything and move forward. The other side desperately clings to hope because hope feels safer than emptiness. But emptiness is not the enemy. Buddhism teaches that emptiness is often the beginning of transformation. The collapse of illusion creates space for truth, and although truth hurts initially, truth eventually liberates the mind from endless emotional waiting. False hope keeps reopening wounds because it repeatedly pulls the mind back into emotional attachment. Every imagined reunion becomes another emotional investment in what no longer exists. Every fantasy strengthens longing. Every emotional rehearsal of what could happen delays acceptance. This is why healing requires learning the difference between possibility and attachment. Yes, life is unpredictable. People sometimes change. Reconciliation occasionally happens, but building your emotional survival around those possibilities creates suffering. Peace cannot depend on uncertain futures. The Buddha constantly taught impermanence because attachment to fixed outcomes creates instability. When the mind demands a specific emotional result, suffering grows. But when the mind learns to remain present without clinging, emotional freedom slowly appears. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop emotionally imprisoning yourself through endless waiting. There is a profound difference. One of the most painful stages of healing comes when you realize the version of the future you hoped for is no longer real. The mind resists this fiercely. It tries bargaining. It tries imagining alternate endings. It tries preserving emotional fantasy. But eventually, reality asks to be accepted fully, and acceptance often feels like death to attachment. This is why many people avoid true acceptance. Acceptance sounds final. Acceptance sounds cold. Acceptance sounds like giving up. But Buddhist acceptance is not emotional surrender. It is the end of internal resistance against reality. It is the moment the mind stops fighting what already is. And strangely, this is where peace finally begins entering. Not because the betrayal suddenly makes sense, not because the pain vanishes overnight, but because emotional energy is no longer being consumed by endless mental resistance. There is immense exhaustion in hoping for what reality continues denying. The body feels it. The nervous system feels it. The soul feels it. This exhaustion slowly disappears once the attachment to emotional fantasy weakens. At first, life may feel strangely quiet. Many people panic during this stage because emotional intensity disappears. They mistake calmness for emptiness, but calmness is often unfamiliar after long periods of emotional chaos. The mind must slowly relearn stability. This takes time. Some days the old hope will return unexpectedly. A memory will trigger longing. Loneliness will make the fantasy feel alive again. The heart will briefly reopen old emotional doors. This is normal. Healing is rarely linear. The important thing is awareness. Instead of automatically feeding the fantasy, you begin observing it gently. You begin recognizing the emotional pattern instead of becoming consumed by it. You notice how the mind reaches for hope whenever grief becomes uncomfortable. You notice how attachment disguises itself as loyalty. You notice how fantasy temporarily protects you from facing finality. This awareness slowly breaks the cycle, and gradually something remarkable begins happening. You stop needing emotional rescue from the person who hurt you. Their return stops feeling necessary for survival. Their apology stops controlling your peace. Their absence stops defining your worth. This is the beginning of emotional liberation, because the deepest prison was never only the betrayal itself. It was the attachment to the hope that betrayal could somehow become love again. Many people spend years trying to emotionally rewrite painful endings. But Buddhism teaches that peace is not found by rewriting reality. Peace is found by seeing reality clearly without attachment distorting it, and reality often reveals painful truths. Some people cannot love you the way you hoped. Some people only entered your life temporarily. Some people were teachers, not lifelong companions. Some people awakened wounds you needed to finally see. These truths hurt deeply at first, because they dismantle illusion. But illusion is fragile. Reality remains stronger. The moment illusion collapses, suffering finally has room to dissolve. Not immediately, not perfectly, but slowly, like fog disappearing under morning light. And eventually, a strange freedom begins emerging. You wake up without immediately checking for signs. You stop replaying conversations constantly. You stop emotionally building imaginary futures with someone who already chose a different path. You stop waiting, and in that quiet space where waiting once lived, peace slowly begins growing. Not dramatic peace, not perfect peace, but honest peace. The kind that no longer depends on another person's return. The kind that no longer begs the past to become different. The kind that finally understands that healing was never about getting back what betrayed you. It was about freeing yourself from the attachment that kept betrayal alive inside your mind. And eventually, this is the next painful truth the heart must face. Sometimes the suffering no longer comes from the betrayal itself. It comes from the waiting. The endless emotional waiting for words that never arrive, for explanations that never come, for apologies that the other person may never be capable of giving. Many people spend years trapped in this invisible emotional prison without realizing it. They believe they are waiting for closure, but in reality they are waiting for permission to finally let go. There is a very deep loneliness in waiting for closure from someone who already moved on. Emotionally, It creates a strange kind of emotional suspension where life continues moving outside, but inside, part of the heart remains frozen in the exact moment everything broke apart. The mind keeps saying, maybe one day they will explain why they hurt me. Maybe one day they will finally understand the damage they caused. Maybe one day I will hear the words that make all this pain make sense. But many times those words never come, and this is one of the hardest Buddhist truths to accept. Not every wound receives closure, not every betrayal receives an apology, not every ending receives an explanation. Some people leave confusion behind them and never return to clean the emotional destruction they caused. And when the mind refuses to accept this, suffering quietly continues year after year. The human mind desperately wants emotional certainty. It wants answers because answers create the illusion of control. When something painful happens without explanation, the mind becomes restless. It keeps searching for meaning because uncertainty feels unbearable. This is why people replay old conversations endlessly after heartbreak. They analyze details repeatedly. They mentally reconstruct events, searching for hidden clues that might finally explain everything. The mind becomes like a detective trapped in an endless investigation. But the investigation never truly ends because the deeper problem is not lack of information. The deeper problem is emotional resistance against reality. The mind believes, if I just understand everything completely, then I will finally feel peace. But Buddhism teaches something radically different. Peace does not come from controlling the past through understanding. Peace comes from releasing the mind's attachment to needing perfect answers before healing can begin. This is difficult because closure feels emotionally sacred to most people. Society teaches that every ending should come with honesty, accountability, emotional clarity, and mutual understanding. But reality often works differently. Some people avoid difficult conversations because they fear guilt. Some disappear without explanation because emotional responsibility feels uncomfortable to them. Some never apologize because protecting their ego matters more than acknowledging your pain. And some simply lack the emotional awareness to fully understand the damage they caused. Waiting for these people to suddenly provide deep emotional closure can become a lifelong prison. The Buddha taught that attachment creates suffering because the mind clings to how things should be instead of seeing things as they are. Closure becomes painful when the mind insists that healing cannot happen until another person behaves differently. This gives enormous power away emotionally. Your peace becomes dependent on someone else's emotional maturity, honesty, self-awareness, or remorse. And many people never develop those things. This truth hurts deeply because the heart naturally wants fairness. Human beings crave emotional justice. They want the person who hurt them to fully see the pain they caused. They want acknowledgement because acknowledgement feels validating. Without it, many people feel invisible. This invisibility creates profound suffering. A person may think, if they never apologize, does that mean none of it mattered? If they never explain themselves, does that mean my pain was meaningless? If they can move on so easily, was I ever truly loved at all? These questions can haunt the mind for years, but Buddhism gently teaches that another person's inability to provide closure does not erase your experience. Your pain existed whether they validate it or not. Your suffering mattered whether they acknowledge it or not. Reality does not disappear simply because someone refuses to face it. Many people unknowingly trap themselves inside emotional waiting rooms. They postpone healing because they are still emotionally expecting one final conversation to rescue them from confusion. But closure rarely arrives in the dramatic way the mind imagines. Sometimes there is no final speech, no perfect explanation, no emotional breakthrough, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Sometimes life simply moves forward while questions remain unanswered. This is incredibly painful for the ego because the ego wants completion. It wants emotional stories tied neatly together. It wants to feel chosen, understood, respected, and emotionally resolved. But life often leaves loose ends, and maturity begins when the mind learns to survive without complete resolution. This is one of the deepest forms of emotional growth, the ability to live without forcing certainty from uncertainty. Many people stay emotionally connected to the past because they confuse understanding with healing. They believe if they can fully understand why someone hurt them, then the pain will disappear. But often, even when explanations are given, suffering still remains. Because explanations do not automatically dissolve attachment. An apology cannot always undo betrayal. A reason cannot always heal abandonment. Words cannot always restore trust once it has collapsed. This is why some people receive the closure they thought they needed and still feel empty afterward. The mind expected emotional liberation, but instead discovers that no explanation can fully reverse pain that has already happened. The Buddhist path teaches that healing begins internally, not externally. Closure is not something another person hands to you. True closure begins when the mind stops emotionally chasing what reality may never provide. This requires tremendous courage because uncertainty feels deeply uncomfortable. The human mind prefers painful answers over unanswered silence. Silence leaves space for imagination, and imagination often creates even greater suffering. The mind fills silence with assumptions. Maybe they never loved me. Maybe I was not enough. Maybe everything was fake. Maybe I was easy to replace. These thoughts become dangerous because the mind begins creating stories in the absence of truth. And once emotional storytelling begins, suffering multiplies quickly. Buddhism teaches that the mind creates much of its own suffering through interpretation. Two people can experience the same betrayal and suffer differently based on the stories they attach to it. One person may say, "This proves I am unlovable." Another may say, "This painful experience taught me something important about attachment." The event may be similar, but the internal relationship to the event changes everything. This is why awareness becomes so important. You begin noticing how often your suffering comes not only from what happened, but from the mind's desperate need to complete unfinished emotional stories. The mind wants endings that feel emotionally satisfying, but reality often refuses to cooperate. Some people leave mid-sentence emotionally, some relationships collapse without clarity, some betrayals remain confusing forever, and part of healing involves accepting that uncertainty itself is part of life. This acceptance does not happen easily. At first, the mind keeps returning to old questions compulsively. It revisits memories repeatedly, hoping new insight will suddenly appear. It replays conversations late at night. It imagines future confrontations. It mentally rehearses emotional speeches that may never happen. All of this creates exhaustion, because emotionally, the person never fully leaves the past. The body continues carrying unresolved emotional tension. The nervous system remains alert. The heart remains open to old pain. And slowly, years pass while life waits outside. This is why attachment to closure can quietly become attachment to suffering itself. The person believes they are searching for healing, but unconsciously they are feeding emotional attachment by continuously revisiting the wound. One of the most painful realizations in healing is understanding that some people may never fully understand the pain they caused you. Not because your pain was unimportant, but because awareness differs from person to person. Some individuals lack emotional depth. Some avoid self-reflection entirely. Some protect themselves through denial. Some rewrite history internally to avoid guilt. And some genuinely cannot face the consequences of their own actions because shame terrifies them. Waiting for these people to suddenly become emotionally enlightened often leads to disappointment. The Buddha emphasized compassion, but compassion does not mean endlessly waiting for emotional accountability from those unwilling to provide it. Compassion also includes freeing yourself from unnecessary suffering, and sometimes freedom requires accepting painful realities without complete emotional satisfaction. This does not mean suppressing grief. Grief still deserves space. Sadness still deserves acknowledgement. Anger still deserves honesty. But there is a difference between feeling pain and becoming imprisoned by emotional waiting. Many people do not realize how much of their emotional life becomes organized around unresolved closure. They check social media hoping for indirect signs. They compare themselves to new partners. They mentally replay scenarios where the person finally regrets losing them. The future becomes emotionally tied to a conversation that may never happen. This creates emotional paralysis, because part of the heart remains turned backward instead of forward. The Buddhist path consistently teaches presence, because attachment to unresolved past experiences prevents full participation in the present moment. You cannot fully experience life while emotionally living inside unfinished emotional negotiations with the past. And this is where suffering quietly deepens. The present moment becomes neglected. New opportunities are missed. Healthy relationships are resisted. Inner peace feels unreachable. Not because healing is impossible, but because emotional energy remains trapped in waiting. Waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for justice, waiting for remorse, waiting for answers, waiting for emotional completion from someone who may never provide it. Eventually, exhaustion begins teaching what wisdom could not. You begin realizing how heavy emotional waiting truly is, how much life it consumes, how much peace it steals, how much time disappears while the mind endlessly circles the same unresolved pain. And slowly, another possibility begins appearing. What if closure is not something you receive? What if closure is something you practice internally? This changes everything, because now healing no longer depends on another person's behavior. Now freedom becomes possible even without explanation. Now peace becomes available even in uncertainty. This is one of the deepest Buddhist truths. You do not need perfect emotional resolution to stop suffering. You only need willingness to stop feeding attachment to what may never arrive. This does not happen instantly. At first, the mind resists fiercely. It says, "But I deserve answers." And perhaps you do. It says, they should acknowledge what they did. And perhaps they should. But healing cannot wait forever for other people to become emotionally ready. Otherwise, your life remains emotionally chained to their choices indefinitely. True freedom begins when you stop asking the past to finally become different. This is not weakness. This is not surrender. This is wisdom, because wisdom recognizes reality without demanding it obey emotional desire. There is tremendous strength in saying, "I may never fully understand why this happened, but I will no longer sacrifice my peace trying to force answers from silence." That sentence alone can begin transforming a life. The nervous system slowly softens afterward. Mental obsession weakens gradually. The heart stops chasing emotional certainty constantly, and something surprising begins happening. The unanswered questions lose some of their power. Not because answers suddenly appear, but because attachment to needing them begins dissolving. This is emotional maturity, the ability to continue living fully even when some parts of life remain unresolved. Children demand perfect endings. Wisdom accepts incomplete stories, and many of the deepest wounds in life remain partially unfinished forever. Yet healing still remains possible. Joy still remains possible. Peace still remains possible. The Buddha taught that suffering decreases when attachment decreases. This includes attachment to closure itself. The more tightly the mind insists on emotional completion from the outside world, the more suffering continues internally. But when the mind finally loosens its grip, space opens. Space for rest. Space for breathing. Space for new experiences. Space for life beyond the wound. At first, this space may feel unfamiliar. People who spent years emotionally chasing closure often feel disoriented once they stop. The mind has been conditioned to constantly revisit the past. Letting go of the search can initially feel empty, but slowly the emptiness changes. It becomes calmness instead of absence, stillness instead of obsession, presence instead of emotional chasing, and eventually you begin understanding something profound. The closure you waited for was never going to save you. The apology was never going to completely erase the pain. The explanation was never going to fully heal betrayal. The mind only believed those things because attachment desperately wanted emotional certainty. But peace was never hiding inside another person's words. Peace was waiting in the moment you finally stopped needing them to speak before allowing yourself to heal. And once the mind finally begins releasing its desperate need for closure, another hidden layer of suffering slowly reveals itself. Even after people accept that the apology may never come, the heart often continues doing something far more deceptive. It begins reshaping the memory itself. The pain slowly becomes softer in memory. The betrayal becomes blurred. The loneliness fades into the background. And suddenly, the person who once shattered your peace begins appearing beautiful again inside your mind. This is where the next illusion begins. There is something deeply confusing about the human mind. Even after someone causes enormous pain, the memory of them can slowly transform into comfort. Months later, sometimes years later, the mind begins replaying their laughter instead of their cruelty. It remembers warmth while minimizing the coldness. It replays tenderness while hiding the emotional damage. And slowly the heart starts missing what once destroyed it. This is one of the most dangerous emotional illusions people experience after heartbreak and betrayal. The mind does not remember the past accurately. It edits it, it reshapes it, it protects certain memories while burying others. And in moments of loneliness, vulnerability, or emotional exhaustion, memory can become deeply dishonest. The Buddha taught that the mind creates suffering through attachment and illusion. One of the greatest illusions is the fantasy version of people we create after they leave. Once attachment becomes strong, the mind stops seeing reality clearly. Instead, it begins creating emotional mythology around the person. This is why someone who caused constant anxiety can later feel unforgettable. Someone who neglected you emotionally can later feel irreplaceable. Someone who betrayed your trust can later appear beautiful in memory. The mind transforms incomplete emotional attachments into fantasies because fantasy feels safer than painful truth. Truth says they hurt you. Fantasy says they were secretly perfect but misunderstood. Truth says the relationship damaged your peace. Fantasy says it was the deepest love you will ever experience. Truth says your nervous system suffered around them. Fantasy says nobody will ever make you feel that alive again. This emotional editing happens slowly and quietly. At first, after betrayal, people usually see the pain clearly. Anger is strong. Disappointment is obvious. Reality still feels visible. But as time passes, emotional intensity changes. The mind becomes selective. It begins filtering memories through longing instead of clarity. This is especially common when loneliness enters the picture. Loneliness has a powerful effect on memory. When people feel emotionally empty, the mind often returns to familiar emotional experiences, searching for comfort. But instead of remembering the full reality, it extracts only emotionally pleasurable fragments: a smile, a voice, a specific moment, a feeling of closeness. The painful patterns surrounding those moments slowly disappear from focus. And this is how harmful people become: emotional fantasies. The mind is not intentionally trying to deceive you, it is trying to protect you from pain. Human beings naturally seek emotional coherence. The brain dislikes holding contradictory truths at once. It struggles to accept that someone could both comfort and destroy you at the same time. So eventually, memory simplifies the story. The mind often preserves what emotionally nourished it while suppressing what emotionally damaged it. This is why people return to relationships they once swore they would never revisit. The emotional memory becomes distorted over time. The suffering loses sharpness while the moments of connection become emotionally magnified. This creates enormous confusion. A person may sit alone at night missing someone who once made them cry constantly. They may crave the return of someone who destabilized their mental health. They may romanticize a relationship that was filled with emotional inconsistency, manipulation, or neglect. From the outside, this appears irrational, but psychologically and spiritually, it is deeply human. The mind craves emotional attachment so strongly that it often rewrites reality to preserve the bond internally. Buddhist wisdom warns about attachment because attachment clouds perception. Once the mind becomes attached, it no longer sees clearly. It sees through desire, fear, memory, and fantasy. This is why people often fall in love not only with who someone truly is, but with the emotional story they created around them. And after separation, that story can become even more powerful than reality itself. A dangerous thing happens when someone becomes unavailable. The mind gains space to idealize them. Reality is no longer present to interrupt fantasy. There are no daily disappointments anymore, no painful arguments, no emotional inconsistencies happening in real time. Only memory remains, and memory can become incredibly deceptive. The brain often preserves emotional highlights while minimizing emotional suffering. This is one reason people revisit old relationships repeatedly. They remember the emotional highs, but forget how exhausting the lows truly felt. The mind begins saying things like, "Maybe it was not that bad. Maybe they actually loved me deeply. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe nobody else will ever understand me like they did." These thoughts become especially powerful during emotional vulnerability. A lonely night can resurrect old fantasies instantly. A difficult season in life can make toxic comfort suddenly feel appealing again. The brain starts associating the past with emotional safety simply because it was familiar. But familiar does not mean healthy. This is one of the most important truths many people fail to understand. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar peace. The mind would rather return to known suffering than step into uncertain healing. This is why romanticized memories become so dangerous. They create emotional gravity, pulling people backward instead of forward. Buddhism teaches that attachment creates mental projections. The mind projects permanence onto temporary things. It projects meaning onto incomplete experiences. And most dangerously, it projects fantasy onto people who never fully existed the way memory now portrays them. Many people are not actually grieving the real person anymore. They are grieving the fantasy version their attachment created afterward. This distinction changes everything, because once you begin seeing clearly, you realize the mind is often mourning emotional imagination more than objective reality. The person in memory becomes softer, wiser, more loving, more emotionally available than they truly were. The painful details become hidden beneath longing, and eventually the fantasy becomes emotionally addictive. The heart starts craving a version of the past that never fully existed. This explains why people sometimes return to relationships only to feel shocked once reality returns again. The fantasy collapses once daily interaction resumes. The emotional neglect reappears. The instability returns. The same wounds reopen, and suddenly they realize they were not missing reality. They were missing imagination. The Buddhist path constantly points toward awareness because awareness interrupts illusion. Awareness asks difficult questions. Was this relationship truly peaceful? Did this person genuinely nourish your spirit? Were you emotionally safe around them consistently? Or are you only remembering selective moments because attachment fears letting go? These questions can feel painful because they challenge emotional fantasy directly, and fantasy can feel comforting. Fantasy protects people from grief temporarily. It softens loneliness. It gives emotional hope. It creates the illusion that something beautiful still exists waiting in memory. But fantasy also traps people emotionally. It keeps them tied to people who are no longer present. It prevents acceptance. It distorts reality. And it prolongs suffering quietly over time. One reason the mind romanticizes harmful people is because emotional intensity gets confused with emotional depth. Many painful relationships create extreme emotional highs and lows. This intensity can feel intoxicating. The nervous system becomes overstimulated constantly. The emotional unpredictability creates obsession. Later, when life becomes calm, the mind mistakes peace for emptiness. Healthy love may initially feel boring compared to emotional chaos. Stillness may feel emotionally flat after years of intensity. This causes many people to romanticize relationships that were actually deeply unhealthy. They miss the adrenaline, not the suffering itself. They miss emotional stimulation, not necessarily genuine connection. The mind confuses emotional exhaustion with passion because it became conditioned to instability. This is why healing often feels strange at first. Healing removes emotional extremes. The nervous system slowly settles. The emotional drama disappears. And for a while, calmness can feel uncomfortable. Many people unconsciously interpret this discomfort as proof that they still belong with the person who hurt them. But in reality, their nervous system is simply adjusting to the absence of emotional chaos. The body can become addicted to unpredictability. This addiction strengthens romanticized memory. The mind begins idealizing emotional intensity because intensity made life feel emotionally consuming. It forgets how draining the instability truly was. It forgets the anxiety, confusion, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion that existed beneath the highs. This selective remembering creates suffering because it disconnects memory from truth. The Buddha taught that wisdom begins with seeing things as they truly are, not as attachment wants them to be. This requires tremendous honesty. Honesty means remembering the full reality, not only the beautiful fragments. Honesty means acknowledging the nights you felt emotionally abandoned. The moments your intuition warned you something was wrong. The constant anxiety, the emotional inconsistency, the way your peace slowly disappeared while trying to preserve the relationship. Without this honesty, memory becomes dangerous, because memory without awareness easily transforms pain into longing, and longing into self-destruction. Many people stay emotionally trapped for years because they continue feeding romanticized memory. They revisit old pictures constantly. They replay idealized moments. They build emotional shrines around relationships that deeply wounded them. This keeps attachment alive internally. Buddhism teaches that attention feeds emotional reality. Whatever the mind continuously returns to gains strength. Repeatedly feeding idealized memories strengthens emotional attachment even when the relationship itself no longer exists. This creates a painful cycle. The more the mind romanticizes the past, the more difficult it becomes to release it. And the more difficult it becomes to release it, the more beautiful the fantasy appears. Eventually, the fantasy can feel more emotionally real than the actual relationship ever was. This is why awareness is liberation. Awareness interrupts emotional distortion. Awareness reminds you that missing someone does not automatically mean they were healthy for you. Craving connection does not always mean genuine compatibility existed. Longing does not prove destiny, and emotional obsession does not equal love. These distinctions are essential for healing, because without them, people continue chasing illusions while abandoning themselves emotionally. One of the deepest forms of suffering comes from betraying your own reality in order to preserve emotional fantasy. Deep down, many people know the relationship damaged them. Their body remembers, their anxiety remembers, their exhaustion remembers. But attachment keeps overriding those signals through romanticized memory. The Buddhist path asks you to trust awareness over fantasy, to trust peace over emotional addiction, to trust clarity over longing. This does not mean becoming bitter toward the past. Bitterness is another form of attachment. Buddhism does not teach hatred toward what hurt you. It teaches clear seeing. Clear seeing says, there were beautiful moments, but there was also suffering. Clear seeing says, I can appreciate what felt meaningful without abandoning reality. Clear seeing says, I do not need to turn pain into fantasy in order to survive its loss. This balance is difficult but transformative, because once the mind stops romanticizing what destroyed it, emotional freedom slowly becomes possible. The person begins reclaiming reality. They stop worshipping memory. They stop confusing fantasy with truth. They stop emotionally rewriting history to preserve attachment, and slowly the emotional grip weakens, not because the memories disappear, but because the illusion surrounding them dissolves. This is one of the quietest forms of healing. There is no dramatic moment, no sudden breakthrough, just gradual clarity. The kind of clarity that allows you to remember someone without emotionally collapsing inside the memory. The kind of clarity that allows you to see both the beauty and the damage honestly. The kind of clarity that finally understands why the mind kept turning pain into longing. And eventually, something changes inside you. The fantasy loses its emotional magic. The mind stops polishing old memories constantly. The person becomes human again instead of mythical. And for the first time, you begin realizing that what you missed most was not always the person themselves. Sometimes it was the emotional story your attachment created around them. And once the fantasy version of the past begins losing its power, another quiet form of suffering rises to the surface. It is not only the person you miss. It is not only the memory you keep polishing. It is the life you thought would happen with them, the future you planned in silence, the version of your story that never arrived, but still lives somewhere inside your heart. This is where many people suffer without knowing how to name the pain. They are not just grieving what happened, they are grieving what never happened. There is a strange pain in missing a future that never became real. Nobody else can see it. Nobody else knows how much it meant to you. To the outside world, the relationship ended, the chapter closed, the person left, and life continued. But inside you, there may still be a hidden world where everything turned out differently. A world where they stayed. A world where they changed. A world where the promises were kept, the plans were fulfilled, and the love did not become a wound. This kind of suffering is silent because it does not always look dramatic. You may still wake up, work, smile, talk, and move through the day. But somewhere beneath everything, The mind keeps replaying the life that could have been, the home you thought you might share, the peace you thought would come, the apology you thought would heal everything, the version of them you hoped would finally appear. And every time the mind enters that unreal future, the heart suffers again. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering deepens when the mind clings not only to what existed, but also to what it desired. Desire does not only attach itself to people, it attaches itself to possibilities, to dreams, to emotional pictures, to imagined endings. And sometimes, what hurts most is not the actual loss, but the imagined life that collapsed with it. This is why some endings feel heavier than others. You are not only saying goodbye to a person, you are saying goodbye to the future your heart secretly built around them. You are saying goodbye to the version of yourself who believed things would become better. You are saying goodbye to the hope that one day the pain would finally be rewarded with peace. That is why what could have been can become its own emotional prison. The mind keeps asking questions that have no living answer. What if they had chosen differently? What if you had said something sooner? What if they had healed? What if they had loved you properly? What if the timing had been better? What if the betrayal had never happened? What if the story did not end there? These questions seem harmless at first, but they slowly pull the mind away from reality. They create a second life inside your thoughts, a life where the ending is always being rewritten, but never actually lived. And because that life exists only in imagination, it can never give peace. It can only keep the wound active. The mind loves unfinished stories because unfinished stories allow fantasy to continue. If something ended without the ending you wanted, the mind keeps trying to complete it. It writes new scenes. It creates emotional conversations. It rebuilds the future again and again, hoping that one imagined version will finally hurt less. But it never does for long. Because after every imagined future comes the return to reality, and reality says, this did not happen. Reality says, they did not stay. Reality says, that version of life is not here. And each return from fantasy back into truth can feel like losing them all over again. This is why replaying what could have been becomes emotional torture. The mind gives you a taste of a future that does not exist, then forces you to feel its absence again. It is like opening a door to a beautiful room, only to realize there is no floor beneath it. Buddhist teaching points us back to the present moment because the present is the only place where life is truly happening. The past is memory. The future is imagination. But suffering grows when the mind refuses to live where the body is. When the body is here, but the mind keeps visiting an unreal future, peace becomes impossible. This does not mean your dreams were foolish. It does not mean your hope was stupid. It means your heart loved deeply enough to build something inside itself. That is human. That is tender. That is not something to hate yourself for. But when the dream has died, continuing to live inside it becomes a form of self-abandonment. Many people do not realize they are grieving an invisible loss. They wonder why they cannot move on. They wonder why the pain still feels so large. But they are not only grieving one moment. They are grieving years of imagined life. They are grieving children never born, homes never built, conversations never had, trips never taken, old age never shared, promises never completed, and peace never received. This grief is real, even if the future never happened. The heart can mourn possibilities. The nervous system can attach to dreams. The mind can suffer from the collapse of something that only existed emotionally. This is why telling yourself it was not real does not always help. Emotionally, it felt real. The hope felt real. The plans felt real. The attachment felt real. And when it disappeared, something inside you still experienced it as loss. But Buddhism teaches that even this must be seen clearly. A possibility is not the same as reality. A dream is not the same as a life. A future you wanted is not the same as a future that was promised by life itself. When the mind forgets this, it begins treating imagination like something stolen from it. It says, "I lost the life I was meant to have." But often what was lost was not destiny. It was attachment to a picture. This truth can hurt, but it can also free you, because if the mind created the picture, the mind can also release it, slowly, gently, not by force, not by pretending it never mattered, but by understanding that the picture is not where your life ends. The danger of what could have been is that it makes the present feel like a punishment. Because the imagined future looks so beautiful, your real life begins to feel smaller. You compare what is here to what your mind invented. You compare your quiet room to the home you thought you would share. You compare your current loneliness to the connection you hoped would last. You compare the person who actually hurt you to the version of them who finally loved you correctly in your imagination. And reality keeps losing against fantasy. But fantasy is unfair competition because fantasy has no flaws. It does not disappoint you in real time. It does not betray you again. It does not ignore your messages. It does not repeat old patterns. It only gives you the scenes you wish had happened. This is why imagined futures can feel more beautiful than actual relationships ever were. The mind edits the future the same way it edits the past. It removes the problems. It removes the anxiety. It removes the repeated hurt. It removes the emotional labor. It removes the parts where you felt unseen, confused, or tired. Then it says, "Look what you lost." But did you truly lose that perfect future? Or did you lose the hope that reality would one day become that future? This question matters because many people stay attached to people who never had the emotional ability to give them the future they are grieving. They mourn a life that the other person may never have been capable of building. They suffer over a dream that required someone to become a version of themselves they never chose to become. And this is where clarity begins. You cannot build a peaceful future with the fantasy of someone. You can only build with who they actually are. If who they actually were brought confusion, fear, abandonment, betrayal, or emotional hunger, then the future your mind keeps replaying may have been built on hope, not truth. This does not make your love meaningless. It makes your suffering understandable. The heart often sees potential before it sees reality. It sees who someone could become. It sees the good hidden behind the pain. It sees the wounded child inside the person who hurt you. It sees the possibility of change. But potential is not presence. Potential is not commitment. Potential is not emotional safety. Potential is not the same as love that can actually hold you. Many people waste years loving potential. Then, when everything ends, they grieve the potential as if it were reality. They say, "We could have been so happy." But the deeper question is, could you truly have been happy with who they consistently chose to be? That question is not asked to create bitterness. It is asked to restore truth. Buddhist wisdom is not interested in punishing the heart for loving. It is interested in ending illusion. It teaches you to see clearly, because without clear seeing, suffering continues. When you stop confusing possibility with reality, something inside begins to soften. You stop blaming yourself for the future that never arrived. You stop treating the ending as proof that you failed. You begin understanding that some futures collapse because they were built on conditions that never truly existed. Sometimes the life you mourn was never available from the person you wanted it from. And that truth, though painful, can become a doorway to peace. The mind often replays what could have been because it wants to avoid the grief of finality. As long as it keeps rebuilding the future in thought, it does not have to fully accept that the chapter is over. The imagined future becomes a hiding place from loss. But hiding from grief keeps grief alive longer. To heal, the heart must eventually turn toward the truth and say, "This future did not happen, and I am allowed to grieve it. But I will not live there anymore." That sentence carries power. It allows sorrow without attachment. It allows mourning without imprisonment. It allows love without self-destruction. It gives the heart permission to feel the loss while still returning to life. Because the goal is not to erase the imagined future by force. The goal is to stop feeding it as if it is still waiting for you. There is a difference between remembering a dream and living inside it. There is a difference between feeling sadness and building a home inside sadness. There is a difference between honoring what you wanted and refusing to accept what is. This is where many people get stuck. They think letting go of the imagined future means betraying their own heart. They think if they stop thinking about what could have been, then all the love becomes meaningless. But love does not become meaningless because you stop suffering for it. A dream does not become worthless because you stop worshipping it. A person does not become erased because you choose peace. Letting go does not say, "It never mattered." Letting go says, "It mattered, but it cannot be where I live forever." That is a sacred difference. Buddhist practice often begins with noticing, not fixing immediately, not forcing yourself to be peaceful, just noticing. Notice when the mind starts building the unreal future again. Notice when loneliness makes old dreams look more beautiful. Notice when disappointment in your current life makes the imagined life feel like rescue. Notice when your heart starts bargaining with the past. This noticing is not small. It is the beginning of freedom. Because the moment you notice the mind creating a future that no longer exists, you are no longer completely lost inside it. There is a small space between you and the thought, and in that space, wisdom can enter. You can gently say, "This is a thought, not my life." You can say, "This is longing, not truth." You can say, "This is grief asking to be felt, not a command to return." Over time, these small moments weaken the fantasy. The mind may still go back. That is normal. Old emotional patterns do not disappear overnight. But each time you return to the present, you teach the mind that survival is possible without the imagined future. You teach the body that it does not need that dream to feel safe. You teach the heart that life still exists beyond the story it once wanted. This is how healing becomes real. Not dramatic, not instant, but steady. A person begins by grieving what never happened. Then slowly, they stop using that grief as proof that life is over. They begin to see the difference between a broken dream and a broken self. The dream ended, but the self remains. The future changed, but life continues. The story did not unfold as planned, but the page is not empty. This is important because what could have been often makes people feel robbed of life itself. They feel as if the best version of their future disappeared with one person. But no single person holds the entire future of your soul. Attachment makes it feel that way. Grief makes it feel that way. But truth is wider than that. Life can still surprise you. Peace can still find you. Love can still return in healthier forms. Joy can still grow in places you have not yet reached. But none of this can fully enter while the mind is kneeling before a future that no longer exists. The heart has limited energy. When it pours that energy into a dead possibility, the present becomes starved. You may not notice it at first, but slowly your attention, hope, creativity, and emotional strength begin flowing towards something that cannot receive them. This is why replaying what could have been is so draining. You are giving life force to an unreal world, and the real world waits quietly for you to come back. There are people you have not met yet. There are versions of yourself you have not discovered yet. There are peaceful mornings you have not lived yet. There are moments of freedom that cannot reach you while your mind keeps returning to the future that died. The Buddhist path asks you to come back, not with shame, not with anger at yourself, but with tenderness. Come back to your breath. Come back to your body. Come back to the room. Come back to the truth. Come back to the life that is actually here, because the present moment may not be perfect, but it is alive. The imagined future may look beautiful, but it cannot hold you. It cannot feed you. It cannot answer you. It cannot grow with you. It is only a picture made of longing, and longing, when mistaken for truth, becomes suffering. This is why acceptance is not passive. Acceptance is one of the bravest acts of the human heart. It means looking at the life that did not happen and choosing not to keep dying beside it. It means saying, I wanted that, but I will not abandon this moment because of it. It means choosing reality, even when fantasy feels sweeter. At first, reality may feel plain. It may feel quiet. It may feel empty compared to the emotional movie your mind created. But reality has something fantasy will never have. It has possibility, real possibility. Not the old kind built around someone who hurt you, but the living kind that opens when you finally return to yourself. This is why Buddhist wisdom says that suffering begins to dissolve when craving begins to loosen. Craving says, life must become the version I wanted, or I cannot be at peace. Wisdom says, life has changed, and I can learn to meet it as it is. That shift may sound simple, but it can transform everything. Because once the mind stops demanding the dead future, it can begin seeing the living present. Once the heart stops begging for the story that ended, it can begin feeling the quiet strength that remains. Once the soul stops asking, what could have been, it can finally begin asking, what is still possible now? And that question is where healing begins to breathe again, not because the loss did not hurt, not because the dream did not matter, not because you are suddenly fine, but because you are no longer allowing an unlived future to keep stealing your actual life. There comes a moment when the heart must bow to what never happened, not as a punishment, but as a release. You can honor the dream, grieve the dream, and still walk away from the dream. You can admit that it hurt, that it mattered, that you wanted it deeply, and still choose not to suffer for it forever. This is the quiet freedom hidden beneath all that pain. You do not need to keep replaying the future that never arrived to prove your love was real. You do not need to keep hurting over the life that did not happen to prove it mattered. You do not need to keep standing inside an imagined tomorrow while your real life waits for you today. The future you lost may have broken your heart, but it does not have to become your home. And slowly, as this truth settles inside you, the question begins to change. The mind no longer asks, why did that future disappear? The heart no longer begs, how do I bring it back? Something quieter begins to rise. A softer question, a freer question. What life is still waiting for me, now that I have stopped living inside the one that never came? And once the heart begins asking what life is still waiting now, another quiet truth rises from beneath the pain. Before a new life can fully enter, the old ghosts must be seen for what they are, not hated, not chased, not worshipped, just seen clearly. Because many people do not remain trapped only because they miss someone. They remain trapped because they are still emotionally serving something that no longer exists. There is a strange kind of suffering that happens when the person is gone. The chapter is over, the future has disappeared, but the heart still behaves as if everything is alive. You keep protecting the memory. You keep defending the relationship in your mind. You keep explaining their behavior to yourself. You keep arranging your emotions around someone who is no longer standing there, and slowly, without realizing it, you begin worshipping an emotional ghost. An emotional ghost is not the real person. It is what remains inside your mind after attachment has turned memory into something sacred. It is the version of them you still talk to in silence, the version you still try to impress, the version whose approval you still crave, the version whose return you still secretly prepare for, even when life has already shown you that the door is closed. This is how attachment becomes spiritual exhaustion. It makes you bow before what is absent. It makes you give emotional energy to what cannot give anything back. It makes you keep feeding a relationship that no longer exists in reality, only in thought, memory, and longing. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the mind creates suffering when it clings to forms that are always changing. A relationship is a form. An identity is a form. A memory is a form. A promise is a form. A version of yourself is also a form. None of these things are permanent. They rise, they change, and one day they pass away. But when the mind refuses to let them pass, it turns them into ghosts. And then the suffering begins. You may not call it worship. You may call it love. You may call it loyalty. You may call it remembering. You may call it honoring what happened. But if your peace still depends on something that is gone, if your emotions still move around someone who no longer shares your life, if your present is still controlled by a past that cannot respond, then attachment has quietly become devotion. This devotion can look gentle from the outside, but inside it is painful. You may wake up and wonder what they would think of you now. You may choose not to move forward because some part of you feels like moving forward would betray the old story. You may reject new happiness because it feels wrong to be free from something you once loved deeply. You may keep yourself emotionally available to a person who is no longer emotionally available to you. That is not love anymore. That is bondage wearing the clothes of love. There is a point where remembering becomes reliving. There is a point where missing becomes serving. There is a point where grief becomes a private temple, and every thought becomes a candle placed before the altar of what has already ended. This is why the Buddha spoke so deeply about attachment. Attachment does not only make you want what is absent, it makes the absent thing feel more powerful than what is present. It gives the past more authority than today. It gives memory more control than truth. It makes something dead inside reality feel alive inside your nervous system. And once this happens, the emotional ghost begins shaping your life. You may avoid certain places because the ghost lives there. You may listen to certain songs just to feel the ghost again. You may keep old messages because deleting them feels like erasing a part of your soul. You may compare everyone new to a person who no longer exists in the same form. You may speak to them in your mind when you are sad, angry, lonely, or afraid. And the painful part is this: the ghost never answers. It only takes. It takes attention. It takes peace. It takes sleep. It takes emotional space. It takes your ability to be fully open to what is still alive around you. It takes the freshness of the present moment and covers it with the shadow of something that has already passed. Attachment does this by making absence feel holy. The mind says, this pain proves it mattered. The heart says, if I stop holding on, then maybe it was never real. So the person keeps suffering as proof of love. They keep remembering as proof of loyalty. They keep waiting as proof that the connection had value. But suffering is not the highest proof of love. Sometimes suffering is only proof that attachment has not yet released its grip. This is a hard truth, because many people are afraid that if they stop hurting, they will stop caring. But peace does not erase meaning. Healing does not insult the past. Moving on does not mean the relationship was worthless. It simply means you have stopped turning your wound into a home. The Buddhist path invites you to look at the ghost without feeding it, to notice the memory without worshipping it, to feel the ache without making it your identity. This is not coldness, this is wisdom, because wisdom understands that what has passed must be allowed to pass, or it will continue living inside you as unfinished suffering. Many people are not only attached to a person, they are attached to who they became around that person. They miss the version of themselves who loved deeply, hoped wildly, believed fully, and dreamed without fear. After the ending, they keep returning to the relationship because they think that version of themselves is still hidden there, but that version is not trapped inside the past. That version is part of you. The love you gave came from you. The tenderness you offered came from you. The hope you carried came from you. The loyalty, patience, forgiveness, and emotional depth were not created by the other person. They were revealed through you. When you worship the ghost, you forget this. You think the person was the source of your deepest feelings, when often they were only the mirror that showed you what your heart was capable of holding. This is why attachment is so deceptive. It makes you believe your own beauty belongs to the one who left. It makes you believe your ability to love exists only in relation to them. It makes you believe that without that person, the most alive part of you has disappeared. But that is not true. What you felt was real, but it was not owned by them. What you gave was sacred, but it did not die with the relationship. What opened inside you can open again in wiser, calmer, healthier ways. The ghost only feels powerful because attachment has convinced you that the best parts of your heart were buried with the past. This is why people continue emotionally serving old relationships. They keep trying to protect the meaning of what happened. They keep trying to prove that their suffering was not wasted. They keep trying to keep the story alive because they fear that if the story dies, the love dies with it. But love does not need to be kept alive through self-abandonment. A relationship can have mattered and still be over. A person can have touched your life and still not belong in your future. A memory can be tender and still not deserve your entire emotional world. This is where freedom begins, not in denying the past, but in placing it where it belongs, behind you, not above you, not inside the center of your heart as a ruler, not in front of you as a destination, behind you as something that shaped you, taught you, wounded you, awakened you, and then ended. The mind resists this because it wants permanence. It wants to turn temporary moments into eternal possessions. But life does not work that way. Everything is moving, every feeling changes, every person changes, every chapter changes, and when you build your emotional safety on something that life has already changed, you begin suffering against the nature of existence itself. This is why worshipping emotional ghosts becomes so painful. You are asking something impermanent to remain alive forever inside you. You are asking memory to replace reality. You are asking absence to become presence. You are asking the past to continue feeding you, even though it has no living hands. At some point, the heart must understand that ghosts are not fed by love, they are fed by attention. Every time you replay the same scene, the ghost grows stronger. Every time you defend them against your own truth, the ghost gains power. Every time you refuse to accept the ending, the ghost becomes more real in your mind than the life in front of you. This is why awareness matters so deeply. You begin asking yourself, what am I still feeding? Not with judgment, not with shame, but with honesty. Am I feeding peace, or am I feeding longing? Am I feeding truth, or am I feeding fantasy? Am I feeding the life that is still here, or am I feeding a shadow that cannot love me back? These questions can hurt, but they also open the door. Because once you see where your energy is going, you can begin taking it back. Taking your energy back does not mean you suddenly stop caring. It means you stop giving your life force to what is no longer alive in your present. It means you stop shaping your future around someone who is not shaping theirs around you. It means you stop letting a memory decide how much happiness you are allowed to receive. Some people unconsciously remain loyal to pain because happiness feels like betrayal. They think, how can I laugh when I lost so much? How can I love again when that story ended so badly? How can I become someone new when the old version of me is still grieving? But healing is not betrayal. Healing is respect for the life that remains. If something hurt you, the most sacred response is not to keep bleeding for it forever. The most sacred response is to become whole again, to learn, to soften, to grow wiser, to stop letting the wound become the main author of your life. Attachment also makes people worship old identities. This part is subtle. Sometimes you are not only attached to the person, but to who you were during that season. Maybe you were the devoted one, the patient one, the fixer, the rescuer, the one who waited, the one who understood, the one who loved beyond reason, the one who stayed when others would have left. That identity can become addictive, because even if the relationship hurt, the role gave you meaning. It made you feel needed. It gave you a mission. It made your suffering feel noble. And when the relationship ends, you may feel empty because the role disappears too. Who are you if you are no longer waiting? Who are you if you are no longer trying to be chosen? Who are you if you are no longer proving your worth through endurance? Who are you if you stop being the person who suffers beautifully? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary, because many people do not fear losing the other person as much as they fear losing the identity built around the pain. They have lived so long inside the role of the wounded lover, the betrayed soul, the abandoned one, or the hopeful one, that freedom feels unfamiliar. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the self is not fixed. The identity you cling to is also changing. You are not required to remain the version of yourself that pain created. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to outgrow the story. You are allowed to stop introducing yourself to life through your wounds. This does not mean pretending nothing happened. It means refusing to let what happened become your permanent name. Many people carry old emotional identities like sacred robes. They keep wearing the grief because it gives them a sense of continuity. The pain becomes proof that the past mattered. But over time, the robe becomes heavy. It prevents movement. It prevents newness. It prevents the lightness that comes when you are no longer performing loyalty to an old wound. There is a quiet freedom in realizing you do not have to keep being who you were when you were hurt. You can become someone who remembers without reliving, someone who loved without being owned by the loss, someone who was betrayed without becoming bitter, someone who hoped deeply without staying imprisoned by hope, someone who grieved, learned, and slowly returned to life. This is the death attachment fears most. Not the death of the person, not the death of the memory, but the death of the old identity that needed the pain to feel real. When that identity begins to dissolve, the mind may panic. It may pull you back with nostalgia, guilt, sadness, or sudden longing. It may whisper, "Do not let go yet. This is who you are. This is your story. This is the only love that mattered." But wisdom answers quietly, "No, this was one chapter. It is not the whole book." That answer is powerful, because the ghost loses power when you stop making it the center of your life. Memories can remain without becoming masters. Love can remain without becoming chains. Lessons can remain without becoming prisons. The past can remain as part of you without controlling all of you. This is the balance the Buddhist path teaches. It does not ask you to destroy your memories. It asks you to stop clinging to them. It does not ask you to hate the person. It asks you to see clearly. It does not ask you to become empty of feeling. It asks you to stop mistaking attachment for devotion. A free heart can remember and still move. A trapped heart remembers and kneels. This difference changes everything. When you are kneeling before an emotional ghost, your life becomes smaller. You may stop dreaming boldly. You may stop trusting your future. You may stop allowing new people close. You may keep comparing every possibility to a memory that has been edited by longing. You may reject peace because it does not feel as intense as pain. But when you rise, the world slowly widens again. You begin noticing small things you ignored before. Your body begins relaxing in moments that once felt unbearable. Your mind stops checking the past so often. You begin making choices for the person you are becoming, not the person who was left behind. This is how the ghost fades, not through force, but through less worship, not through hatred, but through less feeding, not through denial, but through more presence. The ghost fades when you stop building your day around it. It fades when you stop asking old memories to tell you who you are. It fades when you choose your own peace over emotional loyalty to what hurt you. It fades when you let the relationship become history instead of religion. That may sound strong, but for many people, attachment truly becomes a kind of religion. They return to the same memories like prayers. They repeat the same questions like chants. They preserve old objects like sacred relics. They measure new experiences against the old story. They suffer as if suffering is the only way to keep love alive. But love that requires endless suffering is not freedom. It is attachment demanding sacrifice. And Buddhism asks you to stop sacrificing your present to an illusion of permanence. Everything that came into your life was always subject to change. This does not make it meaningless. A flower is not meaningless because it fades. A sunset is not meaningless because it disappears. A season is not meaningless because it ends. Beauty does not require permanence to be real. This is one of the tenderest truths of letting go. Something can be real and temporary. Something can be meaningful and over. Something can have shaped you and no longer belong to you. When you understand this, the need to worship the ghost begins to weaken. You stop demanding that the past remain alive forever just to prove it mattered. You allow it to have mattered in its own time. You allow it to be complete. You allow it to end. And in allowing it to end, you begin returning to yourself. Your energy comes back slowly. Your attention becomes cleaner. Your emotions become less controlled by old shadows. You begin feeling the difference between love and attachment, between memory and obsession, between honoring the past and being haunted by it. This is not a quick process. Some ghosts fade slowly. Some attachments have lived inside the heart for years, but every moment of clear seeing weakens the spell. Every time you choose reality over fantasy, you loosen the chain. Every time you stop feeding the old story, you make space for a new one. And eventually, the heart understands. You were not meant to spend your life serving what has already left. You were not meant to keep proving love through pain. You were not meant to worship memories until the present became invisible. You were not meant to remain emotionally loyal to a version of life that no longer exists. You were meant to wake up, to return, to breathe again, to let the ghosts become ghosts, and let the living life in front of you become sacred again. Because the past may have shaped you, but it is not here to hold you. The memory may visit, but it does not have to rule. The relationship may have mattered, but it does not have to remain your altar. And the version of you who suffered there may deserve compassion, but they do not have to remain your permanent self. The moment you stop worshipping emotional ghosts, you begin discovering a deeper devotion. Not devotion to the past, not devotion to the person who left, not devotion to the wound. Devotion to peace, devotion to truth, devotion to the life that is still breathing inside you, waiting patiently for you to stop serving what no longer exists and finally come home. And after the heart finally begins loosening its devotion to emotional ghosts, another difficult truth slowly appears. Even when people physically leave your life, many times they are never fully allowed to leave spiritually. The body moves forward, but the mind keeps following them. The relationship ends, but the attachment continues chasing them silently through memory, fantasy, longing, regret, and emotional waiting. This is where suffering becomes even deeper, because now the person is gone, yet your spirit still walks behind them. There is a quiet kind of pain that comes from refusing to let people leave completely. Not because you consciously want to suffer, but because part of you still believes that holding on proves love was real. The heart says, if I stop chasing them emotionally, then maybe I never truly cared. So even after someone chooses distance, silence, betrayal, or another path entirely, the mind continues pursuing them invisibly. Sometimes it pursues them through memories, sometimes through imagined conversations, sometimes through social media, sometimes through constant wondering, sometimes through comparison, sometimes through hope, and sometimes through pain itself. This is one of the hardest Buddhist disciplines of all, learning to stop spiritually chasing what already walked away. Most people think letting go is physical. They think distance means release. They think not speaking anymore means the attachment has ended. But many people continue chasing someone internally, long after all external contact disappears. The chase simply becomes quieter. The mind checks whether they still care. The heart wonders if they still think about you. The emotions wait for signs. The soul keeps turning backward. This internal chasing is exhausting because it keeps your energy tied to someone who is no longer walking beside you. Part of your emotional life becomes organized around a person who already left the shared path. And slowly, without realizing it, your spirit becomes stuck, standing at a door life already closed. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment creates suffering because the mind resists change. People leave, feelings change, seasons shift, life moves continuously, but attachment whispers, no, stay, return, explain, choose me again, become who I needed you to be. The chase begins because the ego struggles deeply with rejection and impermanence. When someone leaves, the mind often interprets it as personal failure. It begins asking painful questions. Why was I not enough? What did they find elsewhere? How could they leave after everything we shared? Why was loving me not enough to make them stay? These questions become emotional hooks that keep attachment alive. The mind keeps chasing answers because it believes answers might restore emotional safety, but many times the chase itself becomes the prison. One of the most painful truths in life is that love cannot force alignment. You can deeply love someone who still chooses another direction. You can give your whole heart to someone who still walks away. You can offer patience, loyalty, understanding, and forgiveness, yet still not become someone's chosen future. This truth breaks many people emotionally because they secretly believe enough love should guarantee permanence. But Buddhism teaches otherwise. Nothing can be forced to remain. Not people, not relationships, not identities, not seasons of life. The moment you try spiritually chaining something to yourself through attachment, suffering begins growing quietly underneath everything. This is why chasing people emotionally becomes so destructive. Even when the relationship has ended, the mind continues trying to negotiate with reality. It keeps saying, maybe if I understand more, they will come back. Maybe if I improve enough, they will regret leaving. Maybe if I stay emotionally available, the story is not truly over. And so the person never fully returns to themselves. Part of them remains emotionally stationed in the past. This can continue for years. A person may enter new relationships while still spiritually chasing someone old. They may smile publicly while privately waiting for emotional resurrection. They may build an entire life externally while internally remaining attached to one unfinished chapter. This creates deep emotional fragmentation because your energy becomes divided between what is alive and what is already gone. The Buddha constantly returned to the truth of impermanence because human beings naturally resist endings. The mind wants continuation. It wants certainty. It wants emotional ownership over what once brought comfort. But life cannot be possessed. People are not permanent emotional property. This does not mean relationships are meaningless. It means relationships are experiences, not possessions. They arrive, they transform us. Sometimes they stay longer, sometimes they leave quickly. But attachment suffers because it demands guarantees life was never designed to provide. One reason spiritual chasing becomes so addictive is because the mind confuses pursuit with love. Many people were taught that real love means never giving up. Movies glorify emotional pursuit endlessly. Songs romanticize longing. Society often praises people who continue fighting for relationships no matter how painful things become. But Buddhism asks a deeper question. At what point does fighting for connection become abandonment of self? At what point does loyalty become emotional self-destruction? At what point does holding on stop being love and start becoming fear? These questions are uncomfortable because they force people to confront the hidden motivations beneath attachment. Sometimes the chase is not truly about love anymore. Sometimes it is about fear of emptiness, fear of rejection, fear of starting over, fear of losing identity, fear of accepting reality fully. And so the mind keeps spiritually following what already left. You can see this clearly in small behaviors. Someone repeatedly checks an old profile hoping for hidden meaning. Someone mentally rehearses future reunions constantly. Someone keeps old messages like sacred objects. Someone secretly compares every new person to the one who left. Someone refuses new love because emotionally they are still unavailable to the past. This is spiritual chasing. The body may have stopped running after them physically, but internally the attachment continues pursuing them every day, and this pursuit creates invisible exhaustion. The nervous system never fully relaxes. The mind remains alert for signs. The heart stays emotionally open to a return that may never happen. Peace becomes impossible because internally the chase never ended. Buddhist discipline teaches something incredibly difficult yet deeply liberating, allowing people to leave completely, not partially, not temporarily, not while secretly keeping emotional doors unlocked forever, but fully. This does not mean hatred, it does not mean bitterness, it does not mean pretending the relationship meant nothing. It means accepting reality without spiritually dragging someone behind you through endless attachment. This is rare because most people fear complete release. They fear it will erase the love. They fear it will invalidate the memories. They fear it will make the relationship meaningless. But letting people leave completely does not erase meaning. It simply stops converting love into suffering. There is enormous wisdom in understanding that some people were only meant to walk beside you temporarily. The ego hates this idea because the ego wants permanence. It wants emotional contracts guaranteeing lifelong security. But life does not operate through guarantees. Sometimes people enter your life to awaken parts of you. Sometimes they expose wounds you needed to see. Sometimes they teach painful lessons about attachment. Sometimes they mirror your deepest fears and desires. And sometimes they simply share a season before continuing elsewhere. The suffering begins when the mind refuses to allow movement. This is why Buddhism places such deep importance on non-attachment. Non-attachment does not mean not loving. It means loving without trying to imprison life into fixed forms. A free heart says, "I loved you deeply, and I also allow reality to move." An attached heart says, "I cannot survive unless you stay." This difference changes everything emotionally. One creates peace. The other creates endless chasing. Many people remain spiritually tied to relationships because they never fully mourned the ending honestly. Instead of grieving, they remained emotionally negotiating with reality. Part of them kept believing the story was unfinished. But there comes a moment when healing requires recognizing that not every story continues. Some chapters truly close. Some people truly leave. Some connections truly transform into memory. And accepting this is not weakness, it is emotional maturity. The mind resists this fiercely at first because complete release feels terrifying. Attachment often becomes intertwined with identity. People begin asking themselves painful questions. If I stop chasing them emotionally, who will I become? If I truly let go, what remains? If they are really gone, then what happens to the version of me that existed with them? These fears are real because attachment often shapes identity deeply. A person may spend years orienting their emotional world around another human being. Their routines, dreams, emotions, hopes, and self-worth slowly become connected to the relationship. When the relationship ends, they feel spiritually disoriented. This is why the chase continues. The mind is not only chasing the person, it is chasing emotional continuity. It is trying to preserve the old version of reality. But Buddhism teaches that identity itself is fluid. You are not required to remain who you were in the middle of attachment. You are allowed to transform after loss. You are allowed to become someone new after heartbreak. This is difficult because grief often makes people freeze emotionally. They stop evolving because part of them remains waiting for the old story to resume. But life keeps moving whether attachment accepts it or not. The seasons continue changing. The body continues aging. The world continues unfolding. And eventually, the cost of spiritually chasing the past becomes unbearable. A person realizes they are missing their own life while emotionally following someone else's footsteps. This realization hurts deeply, but it also becomes the beginning of liberation, because now awareness enters. You begin noticing how often your thoughts revolve around them. You begin noticing how your mood changes based on imagined scenarios involving them. You begin noticing how much emotional energy is still flowing backward instead of forward. This awareness is essential because unconscious attachment controls people silently. Once you see the pattern clearly, you can begin interrupting it gently, not through force, not through emotional violence against yourself, but through honest return to the present moment. Each time the mind begins chasing them mentally, you return. Each time fantasy tries reopening the story, you return. Each time longing pulls you backward, you return. This return becomes spiritual discipline, not glamorous discipline, quiet discipline. The discipline of no longer feeding attachment automatically. One of the deepest misunderstandings about letting go is that people think it means no longer caring. But complete release can coexist with deep love. You can love someone and still stop spiritually chasing them. You can honor what existed while accepting what ended. This balance is profound because it allows tenderness without imprisonment. It allows memory without obsession. It allows grief without endless attachment. Many people fear complete release because they think it means emotionally abandoning the relationship. But often, complete release is the most respectful thing possible. Why? Because chasing someone spiritually after they have chosen another path often dishonors reality itself. It keeps both people trapped inside unfinished emotional energy. Freedom begins when reality is allowed to be real. If someone left, they left. If someone changed, they changed. If someone no longer chooses the relationship, that truth must eventually be faced fully. This facing is painful, but pain faced honestly heals far more deeply than pain endlessly avoided through attachment. Buddhist practice constantly returns to presence because presence interrupts chasing. You cannot fully inhabit the present moment while spiritually pursuing someone in the past. Your awareness becomes split. Part of you remains absent from your actual life, and absence from your own life creates suffering. This is why people often feel emotionally numb after heartbreak. Their energy remains elsewhere. They are physically present, but spiritually turned backward. The discipline of letting people leave completely is ultimately the discipline of returning home to yourself. Returning your attention, returning your emotional energy, returning your identity, returning your future, returning your spirit from the endless pursuit of what already walked away. This process happens gradually. At first, the attachment still calls to you constantly. You still want signs. You still replay memories. You still fantasize about reconciliation. You still wonder if they miss you too. This is normal. The goal is not perfection. The goal is awareness and gentle release. Over time, something remarkable begins happening. The emotional urgency weakens. The mind stops chasing constantly. The nervous system relaxes slightly. The obsession loses intensity. And for the first time in a long time, silence no longer feels unbearable. This silence becomes sacred, because within it you begin rediscovering yourself beyond attachment. You begin learning who you are when you are no longer emotionally revolving around another person. You begin reconnecting with your own inner life, your own values, your own peace, your own future. This is one reason Buddhist wisdom emphasizes solitude and stillness. Without external emotional chasing constantly consuming awareness, deeper truths become visible. You begin realizing that much of your suffering came not only from loss itself, but from resistance against loss. The endless inner argument saying, "This should not have ended." Once that argument softens, suffering softens too. Not immediately, not completely, but noticeably. You breathe differently. You sleep differently. You think differently. The world slowly stops revolving around the absence. And eventually, a profound truth begins settling into the heart. You cannot walk fully into your future while spiritually chasing someone into the past. At some point, the chase must end. Not because the relationship meant nothing, but because your life still matters too. Your peace matters. Your spirit matters. Your future matters. And no relationship should require lifelong emotional pursuit after reality has already spoken clearly. This is why letting people leave completely is such a rare discipline. It requires surrendering fantasy. It requires accepting impermanence. It requires facing loneliness honestly instead of escaping through attachment. But it also creates enormous freedom, because the moment you stop spiritually chasing what already left, your energy begins returning to the only place healing can truly happen. Here, now. Inside the life still waiting for you to finally stop running after closed doors and start walking toward yourself again. And once the spirit finally begins stopping its endless chase after what already walked away, another painful truth begins revealing itself. Even after people leave physically, many times the suffering continues because the mind keeps bringing them back internally. The relationship ends once in reality, but inside the mind it keeps happening again and again. This is why some wounds never seem to close. Not because time stopped moving, but because the mind keeps reopening the door every single day. There is a silent form of suffering that most people never notice while it is happening. They think they are simply remembering. They think they are processing emotions. They think they are trying to understand what happened. But often, what they are really doing is reliving the pain repeatedly until the nervous system no longer knows the difference between past and present. The body may be sitting safely in a quiet room, yet emotionally it feels as though the heartbreak is happening all over again. This is the hidden danger of emotional rumination. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the mind has the power to recreate suffering long after an event has already passed. In many ways, the first wound happens in reality, but the deeper suffering happens through repetition inside consciousness. Every time the mind revisits the pain without awareness, it gives the experience new life again. This is what Buddhism means by mental rebirth. The event dies, but the mind keeps resurrecting it. The betrayal ends, but the mind keeps replaying it. The rejection happens once, but the emotional reliving happens thousands of times, and each return strengthens the suffering. This is why some people remain emotionally trapped for years, even when nothing new is happening anymore. The pain is no longer coming from the outside world. It is being continuously recreated internally through thought, memory, imagination, and emotional repetition. The mind becomes both the wounded place and the wound itself. Many people do not realize how powerful repeated thought truly is. Every thought affects the nervous system. Every memory carries emotional energy. When a painful memory is revisited intensely, the body responds as if the experience is happening again in real time. The heart rate changes, muscles tighten, breathing shifts, anxiety rises, sadness deepens. The body cannot always distinguish between physical danger and emotional memory. This is why emotional rumination becomes exhausting. A person may spend hours mentally replaying conversations, imagining alternate outcomes, analyzing small details, or reliving painful moments repeatedly. And with every repetition, the emotional pathways grow stronger. The suffering becomes more deeply carved into the nervous system. Buddhist teaching explains that attention gives energy to experience. Whatever the mind repeatedly feeds becomes stronger inside consciousness. This means that repeatedly feeding painful thoughts deepens attachment to suffering itself. The mind begins creating loops. One memory triggers another. One regret triggers another. One painful question creates 10 more. The person becomes trapped inside mental repetition, and over time, the repetition itself becomes automatic. This is why many people wake up already hurting before the day even begins. Their mind instantly returns to the wound the moment consciousness returns in the morning. Before they even touch the floor with their feet, the memories begin again. The brain becomes conditioned toward suffering, not intentionally, not because the person wants pain, but because the mind develops habits. And emotional habits can become incredibly powerful. Some people replay old arguments every night before sleeping. Others revisit betrayal during quiet moments. Some constantly mentally rehearse what they wish they had said. Others repeatedly imagine conversations that will never happen. All of this creates mental rebirth. The past keeps becoming emotionally alive again. This is one reason Buddhist meditation focuses so deeply on awareness of thought. Most people live completely identified with their thinking. They assume every thought deserves attention, every memory feels important, every emotional impulse feels urgent. But Buddhist wisdom teaches that thoughts are temporary mental events, not ultimate truth. A painful memory can arise without needing to be worshipped. A thought can appear without needing to control the entire nervous system. A feeling can exist without becoming identity. This understanding changes everything, because once you realize the mind is recreating suffering through repetition, you begin understanding why healing requires presence instead of endless mental revisiting. The problem is that emotional rumination disguises itself as problem-solving. The mind says, if I think about this long enough, maybe I will finally understand everything. Maybe I will find closure. Maybe I will discover what I missed. But many times the mind is not truly seeking wisdom anymore. It is trapped in emotional compulsion. There is a difference between reflection and rumination. Reflection creates understanding. Rumination creates imprisonment. Reflection eventually brings clarity. Rumination endlessly circles the same pain without resolution. Reflection allows emotional movement. Rumination keeps emotional energy frozen in place. Many people confuse the two. They believe repeatedly revisiting pain is helping them heal. But often they are only deepening the emotional pathways connected to suffering. This is why the pain feels fresh even years later. The wound keeps being emotionally reopened. The Buddha taught that suffering grows through attachment, and one form of attachment is attachment to painful thought itself. Human beings often cling to suffering because suffering creates emotional familiarity. It becomes mentally habitual. The mind begins returning to pain automatically because pain became emotionally practiced. This is especially true after betrayal, heartbreak, humiliation, abandonment, or emotional trauma. The mind keeps scanning the past, searching for certainty. It tries to protect itself from future pain by endlessly reviewing old pain. But this protection becomes self-destruction. The nervous system remains trapped in survival mode. Peace becomes difficult because the mind never truly rests. The body carries emotional exhaustion constantly, and slowly life becomes smaller because so much energy is spent mentally reliving what already happened. One of the most painful aspects of rumination is that it creates emotional time travel. A person stops living in the present moment psychologically. Their awareness remains trapped inside old emotional experiences. Even while life continues moving externally, internally they are still standing in the same painful scene. This creates deep emotional stagnation. Growth slows down. Joy feels distant. New experiences feel emotionally muted. The present moment becomes overshadowed by constant mental return to the past. This is why Buddhist wisdom places enormous emphasis on returning attention to the present moment. The present moment interrupts mental rebirth. It breaks the cycle temporarily. Presence reminds the nervous system that the painful event is not happening right now. Right now, the body is breathing. Right now, the room is quiet. Right now, the danger is memory, not immediate reality. This may sound simple, but it is deeply transformative, because suffering often survives through unconscious repetition. Once awareness enters, the cycle begins weakening. You start noticing how often the mind returns to the same scenes. You notice how certain songs trigger emotional spirals. You notice how loneliness strengthens mental replaying. You notice how silence becomes filled with old conversations. This awareness matters because unconscious suffering controls people far more deeply than conscious suffering. Most people do not realize they are mentally choosing the past repeatedly, not intentionally, but habitually. The mind has been trained toward emotional repetition. This training often begins early in life. Many people learned to overthink because uncertainty felt dangerous. They learned to mentally replay situations, trying to avoid future pain. Over time, the brain associated rumination with emotional survival. If I keep thinking about it, maybe I can prevent it from happening again. But eventually, the thinking itself becomes harmful. Instead of protecting the person, it keeps them emotionally wounded. Buddhism teaches that awareness creates freedom because awareness allows you to observe thoughts without automatically following them. This is one of the deepest spiritual disciplines, to notice a painful memory arising and not immediately fall inside it, to observe sadness without becoming consumed by endless storytelling, to allow emotion without feeding emotional repetition. This does not mean suppressing pain. Suppression is different from awareness. Suppression pushes emotion away forcefully. Awareness allows emotion while remaining present. Many people fear presence because presence initially feels empty after long periods of rumination. The mind became accustomed to emotional intensity. Without constant replaying, there is suddenly silence, and silence can feel frightening, because silence forces the person to meet themselves without distraction. This is one reason people unconsciously continue suffering mentally. Rumination gives the mind something to do. It creates emotional occupation. Without it, unresolved emptiness becomes visible. But Buddhism teaches that emptiness is not the enemy. Emptiness is space, and within that space, healing slowly becomes possible. At first, the mind resists this strongly. It keeps pulling attention backward. It says, just think about it one more time. Just revisit the memory again. Just analyze what they meant. Just replay the ending. The mind believes repetition will eventually produce relief. But repetition rarely produces peace. It usually produces deeper emotional exhaustion. This is why people sometimes feel physically drained after hours of overthinking. Emotional rumination consumes enormous nervous system energy. The body remains tense while the mind loops through unresolved pain. Sleep suffers, focus suffers, creativity suffers, presence disappears. The person becomes emotionally trapped inside mental repetition. Buddhist teaching explains that thoughts are like seeds. Whatever thoughts are watered, repeatedly grow stronger. If painful thought patterns are constantly reinforced, suffering becomes deeply rooted internally. This does not mean you are responsible for every painful thought that appears. Thoughts naturally arise. Memories naturally return sometimes. The suffering deepens when the mind unconsciously clings to them, expands them, feeds them, and builds identity around them. A painful thought appears. Then attachment says, "This thought defines me. This pain is who I am. This story is my entire life." And suddenly, suffering becomes identity. This is dangerous because identity built around pain resists healing. The ego begins protecting the suffering because the suffering became familiar psychologically. The person starts introducing themselves internally through the wound. The betrayed one, the abandoned one, the rejected one, the broken one. And once this identity forms, the mind continuously searches for evidence confirming it. This strengthens emotional rumination further. Buddhist wisdom gently interrupts this process by reminding you that thoughts, emotions, memories, and identities are all impermanent. They arise, they pass, they transform constantly. You are not required to become every painful thought that visits your mind. This realization creates tremendous freedom, because now the painful memory can exist without fully owning you. The sadness can arise without becoming your permanent reality. The past can be remembered without becoming your current home. This shift takes practice. The mind will continue trying to revisit old suffering automatically for a while. Years of emotional conditioning do not disappear instantly, but each moment of awareness weakens the cycle slightly. Each time you notice the rumination and gently return to the present, new emotional pathways begin forming. Each time you choose breathing over spiraling, stillness over obsession, observation over identification, healing slowly deepens. One of the most beautiful truths in Buddhist teaching is that freedom does not require erasing memory. You do not need to destroy the past to stop suffering from it. You only need to stop continuously rebirthing it mentally. This changes the entire relationship with pain. Now healing becomes less about forgetting and more about no longer feeding the wound unconsciously. The memories may still exist, certain moments may still hurt, some grief may still remain. But the constant emotional resurrection weakens. The mind stops building temples around pain. The nervous system begins experiencing safety again. And eventually something quiet begins happening. You start having moments where the past is not controlling your emotional state, moments where silence feels peaceful instead of threatening, moments where memory arises softly without dragging you into emotional collapse. These moments matter deeply because they prove the cycle is weakening. This is why meditation, mindfulness, breath awareness, and present moment practices are so central in Buddhism. They retrain attention. They teach the mind how to exist without endlessly feeding suffering. At first, presence feels fragile. The mind still wanders backward frequently, but gradually awareness becomes stronger than emotional habit. And once this happens, the relationship with pain transforms completely. You no longer become instantly consumed by every memory. You stop interpreting every painful thought as a command to suffer. You begin realizing that thoughts are passing weather, not permanent identity. This realization creates spaciousness inside consciousness. The mind becomes less crowded, the heart becomes less heavy, the nervous system begins trusting stillness again, and slowly life starts returning. Colors feel brighter, moments feel more alive, simple experiences feel meaningful again, because your awareness is no longer trapped entirely inside emotional repetition. The Buddha taught that suffering survives through craving and attachment. Rumination is one form of craving. The mind craves emotional completion, certainty, understanding, or control over the past, and so it keeps revisiting the wound endlessly. But true peace begins when the mind stops demanding that the past become different. This acceptance is not passive resignation. It is release from endless internal struggle. You stop mentally arguing with reality. You stop trying to emotionally rewrite what already happened. You stop reopening wounds, hoping they will finally produce a different outcome. And within this release, enormous healing becomes possible. Not because the past disappears, but because you finally stop carrying it into every present moment repeatedly. There is profound wisdom in realizing that the event itself may have lasted days, months, or years, but the suffering afterward often continues because the mind keeps recreating it internally. Once this becomes visible, compassion becomes important, not self-hatred, not shame for overthinking. Compassion, because the mind was trying to protect you the only way it knew how. It kept revisiting the pain, trying to gain control over uncertainty. But eventually, wisdom gently says, "You do not need to keep reliving the fire to prove you survived it." That sentence alone can change a life. You survived. The event ended, the memory remains, but it does not need to become your permanent emotional climate. And slowly, through awareness, presence, and gentle release, the cycle of mental rebirth begins weakening. The wound finally stops being reopened every day. The nervous system slowly exits survival mode. The heart begins resting again. And for the first time in a very long time, the past starts becoming something you remember instead of something you continuously live inside. And after the mind slowly begins breaking free from the endless cycle of reliving the past, another hidden illusion finally comes into view. Beneath the overthinking, beneath the rumination, beneath the emotional replaying, there is often one quiet belief controlling everything else. The belief that peace cannot fully return unless they return too. This belief is one of the deepest emotional traps the human heart can fall into, because as long as healing depends on another person's return, your peace remains outside your own hands. There is a painful kind of waiting that happens silently inside many people. They continue living their lives on the surface, but deep down they are emotionally paused. A part of them still believes that true healing will only begin if the person comes back, apologizes, changes, explains everything, or finally becomes the version they once hoped for. Until then, the heart remains unfinished. This illusion becomes incredibly powerful after betrayal, abandonment, heartbreak, or emotional loss. The mind begins attaching salvation to the person who caused the wound. It quietly says, if they return, then maybe the pain will finally make sense. If they choose me again, maybe I will finally feel worthy. If they come back changed, maybe my suffering will finally end. And so healing becomes delayed indefinitely. The person unknowingly places their inner peace inside someone else's future decisions. This is one of the deepest forms of attachment because it transforms another human being into the emotional gatekeeper of your wholeness. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering grows whenever happiness becomes dependent on conditions outside yourself. As long as peace requires a specific outcome, the mind remains trapped in craving. It keeps saying, I can only be okay if reality changes. But reality may never change in the way attachment demands. This is why the illusion becomes so painful. The mind keeps building emotional survival around something uncertain, a message, a return, a reunion, a confession, an apology, a sudden transformation. And because these things remain outside your control, your nervous system stays emotionally unstable. Your peace becomes fragile because it depends on possibilities instead of presence. Many people do not realize how deeply they have tied their worth to another person's return. They think they simply miss someone, but underneath the missing is often a deeper belief. If they come back, then I matter. If they regret losing me, then I was valuable. If they choose me again, then I am lovable. This is why rejection hurts so deeply. It attacks identity. The mind begins interpreting someone's departure as proof of personal inadequacy. Instead of seeing another person's choices as reflections of their own path, limitations, wounds, or emotional capacity, the suffering person internalizes the abandonment completely. And once this happens, healing becomes attached to external validation. The heart starts waiting for emotional rescue from the same place the wound came from. This creates enormous suffering because the person unknowingly gives away their emotional authority. They place their sense of completeness into someone else's hands. The mind keeps believing that the missing piece of peace exists outside the self. But Buddhist teaching gently points in another direction. The peace you seek cannot fully arrive from the return of another person because the deepest wound was never only their absence. The deepest wound became the belief that without them, you are incomplete. This belief quietly controls countless lives. Some people spend years emotionally unavailable to the present because they are still waiting for someone's return to restore meaning to their life. Others reject new possibilities because emotionally they are still reserved for an old attachment. Some continue secretly hoping for reconciliation long after reality has clearly moved elsewhere. And during all this waiting, life continues passing by. The Buddha taught that attachment creates illusion, and one of the strongest illusions is believing another person contains your wholeness. Love can deeply enrich life, but no human being was meant to become the sole foundation of your emotional existence. When this happens, attachment turns into dependency. Dependency says, Without you, I cannot feel alive. Dependency says, without your love, I cannot recognize my worth. Dependency says, without your return, I cannot move forward. This is why heartbreak often feels like identity collapse. The relationship did not simply end externally. Internally, the mind lost the emotional structure it depended on for security, meaning, and self-recognition. And suddenly, emptiness appears everywhere. The person feels emotionally disoriented. Food tastes different. The world feels quieter. Nothing feels exciting. The future loses color. Not only because someone left, but because the self became emotionally fused with the relationship. Buddhist wisdom constantly reminds us that attachment creates suffering because all external conditions are temporary. People change, relationships shift, life moves unpredictably. If your inner stability depends entirely on something impermanent remaining unchanged forever, suffering becomes inevitable. This truth sounds harsh at first, but hidden inside it is enormous freedom. Because if your peace was never truly inside another person, then your healing does not require their return either. This realization can feel shocking. The mind resists it fiercely because attachment desperately wants reunion to become salvation. It wants the story repaired externally. It wants emotional justice. It wants reassurance that the love mattered enough to bring the person back. But even when reunions happen, they rarely heal the deeper wound automatically. Many people spend years fantasizing about reconciliation, only to realize afterward that the return did not create the peace they expected. Why? Because the original suffering often came from internal dependency, not merely physical separation. A person may return while the insecurity remains. The relationship may resume while the fear of abandonment continues underneath. The longing may temporarily quiet down, but attachment still creates instability. This is why Buddhist teaching focuses less on controlling external outcomes and more on transforming the relationship with attachment itself. True peace begins the moment you stop needing someone's return to feel whole. Not because you stop loving them, not because the memories disappear, not because the loss suddenly becomes painless, but because your existence no longer depends on another person validating it through presence. This shift changes everything internally. The nervous system begins relaxing because emotional survival is no longer tied to uncertainty. The mind stops obsessively searching for signs. The heart stops bargaining with reality constantly. And slowly, identity begins rebuilding from within instead of from external attachment. This process takes enormous courage because many people secretly fear their own emptiness. They built so much emotional meaning around the relationship that without it, they feel spiritually hollow. This emptiness can feel terrifying at first, but Buddhism teaches something profoundly important. Emptiness is not destruction. Emptiness is space, and space allows transformation. The problem is that most people panic when emotional emptiness appears. Instead of sitting with it, they immediately try filling it through fantasy, hope, memory, distraction, or emotional chasing. They fear what will happen if they fully stop depending on the other person internally. But eventually, the soul grows exhausted from dependency. The waiting becomes too painful. The emotional instability becomes unbearable. The endless longing becomes spiritually draining. And slowly, a deeper wisdom begins emerging. The realization that no human being can permanently carry the burden of completing another person's identity. This realization is liberating because it returns power inward. Now healing no longer depends on another person awakening emotionally. Now peace no longer depends on reconciliation. Now self-worth no longer depends on being chosen. This does not happen overnight. The mind continues resisting for a while. It still fantasizes about reunion occasionally. It still imagines emotional repair. It still wonders whether they think about you too. But gradually, the emotional dependency weakens, and something remarkable begins happening. You stop measuring your worth through their absence. This is one of the deepest turning points in healing. Because as long as someone's departure defines your value, attachment still controls your identity. The moment you stop interpreting abandonment as proof of inadequacy, emotional freedom begins appearing. The Buddha taught that suffering decreases when craving decreases. Craving is not only craving pleasure, it is also craving emotional outcomes. Craving reconciliation, craving validation, craving certainty, craving emotional rescue. The mind keeps saying, "I need this to happen before I can be okay." But true liberation begins when the heart whispers something radically different. "I can survive even if this never changes." That sentence transforms the nervous system, because now emotional stability no longer depends entirely on the outside world. You stop emotionally kneeling before uncertainty. You stop worshipping possibilities. You stop treating another person's future decisions as the source of your inner life. This does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It means becoming emotionally grounded. Grounded people can love deeply without collapsing when life changes. Grounded people can grieve honestly without losing themselves entirely. Grounded people understand that relationships enrich life, but do not define the total worth of existence itself. This understanding creates tremendous peace, because once you stop needing someone's return to feel whole, their absence loses some of its power over your nervous system. You stop mentally revolving around them constantly. The emotional urgency weakens. The fantasy begins dissolving, and slowly your attention returns to your own life again. This return is sacred, because many people abandon themselves emotionally while waiting for someone else. They stop developing, stop dreaming, stop opening, stop living fully. Part of them remains emotionally frozen in the past, but life continues asking for participation. Life continues unfolding. And eventually the heart realizes something profound. The person you were waiting for to save you from emptiness was never supposed to become your entire source of emotional wholeness in the first place. This realization can feel painful because it dismantles fantasy. But fantasy was exhausting you. Fantasy kept your healing delayed. Fantasy kept your identity externally dependent. Reality, though painful initially, eventually creates freedom. One of the most transformative moments in healing happens when you notice yourself feeling peaceful without thinking about them for a while. At first, this moment feels strange, almost guilty. Part of the mind panics and says, "Does this mean I no longer care?" But what is actually happening is something beautiful. Your nervous system is finally experiencing life beyond attachment. These moments grow slowly. You laugh sincerely again. You enjoy simple experiences again. You wake up without immediate heaviness sometimes. The world begins feeling alive beyond the relationship. And gradually, the illusion weakens. You realize healing was never hiding inside their return. Healing was hiding inside your return to yourself. This changes the entire journey. Now, instead of emotionally waiting for another person to rescue your peace, you begin cultivating peace internally through awareness, presence, compassion, stillness, honesty, self-respect, emotional responsibility. These become the new foundation, not another person's behavior, not uncertain possibilities, not emotional fantasy. This foundation is far more stable because it cannot be taken away as easily by external change. The Buddha constantly emphasized inner awareness because anything dependent entirely on external conditions eventually becomes unstable. This includes relationships when attachment turns them into emotional survival systems. Healthy love flows freely. Attachment clings desperately. Healthy love appreciates presence. Attachment fears absence constantly. Healthy love allows change. Attachment fights reality endlessly. This distinction becomes clearer as healing deepens. You begin understanding that wanting someone is not the same as needing them for emotional existence. And this difference creates immense liberation, because now you can remember someone without collapsing emotionally. You can miss them without becoming imprisoned by longing. You can appreciate what existed without requiring its return for your happiness. This balance is one of the deepest forms of emotional maturity, and eventually, another truth quietly emerges. The version of yourself waiting desperately for their return was often the version most disconnected from inner peace. Waiting kept you emotionally suspended. Waiting kept your nervous system unstable. Waiting kept your life postponed. But now, without noticing it at first, something inside begins standing on its own again. You begin making choices based on your own well-being instead of imagined reconciliation. You stop asking whether every action might bring them back. You stop shaping your identity around being chosen. You stop treating your future like a waiting room. And this is where true healing finally begins breathing fully. Not because the loss disappeared, not because the memories vanished, but because your soul finally stopped handing its wholeness to someone else. The Buddha taught that freedom begins where attachment loosens its grip. And one of the deepest attachments humans carry is the belief that another person holds the missing piece of themselves. But wholeness was never lost. It was simply buried beneath dependency, fear, longing, and emotional identification. The moment you stop needing another person's return to validate your existence, you begin discovering something extraordinary. You were never incomplete to begin with. You were wounded. You were grieving. You were attached. You were afraid. But incomplete? No. Your value did not leave with them. Your future did not leave with them. Your soul did not leave with them. Only the attachment convinced you otherwise. And once that attachment begins dissolving, peace slowly enters the spaces where desperation once lived, quietly, gently, honestly, until one day you realize something that once felt impossible. You no longer need someone's return to feel alive inside your own life again. And once the heart finally begins realizing that peace does not depend on someone's return, another hidden layer of suffering becomes visible. Because even after people understand they do not need another person to come back, many still struggle with something quieter, deeper, and far more subtle. They built their emotional survival around another human being without realizing it. Little by little, attachment stopped being love and became dependence. Their mood depended on another person's attention. Their peace depended on another person's consistency. Their self-worth depended on another person's affection. Their emotional stability depended on another person staying emotionally available. And slowly, without noticing, inner peace disappeared. There is a form of emotional dependency that does not look dramatic from the outside. A person can appear independent, successful, calm, even emotionally strong. But internally, their emotional world revolves around another human being so completely that they no longer know how to feel safe within themselves. Their nervous system depends on external reassurance. Their happiness depends on emotional validation. Their calm depends on another person not withdrawing. This is why attachment becomes so dangerous. It quietly replaces inner stability with emotional dependence until your peace no longer belongs to you. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering grows whenever the mind attaches its sense of safety to impermanent things. Relationships are beautiful, meaningful, and deeply human, but they are still impermanent. Human emotions shift, people change, circumstances evolve, life moves constantly. When your inner balance becomes entirely dependent on something constantly changing, fear quietly enters the nervous system, and fear changes everything. A person begins fearing abandonment constantly, fearing rejection, fearing emotional distance, fearing silence, fearing conflict, fearing change. The relationship may still exist externally, but internally, the person no longer feels free. Their emotional state becomes controlled by another person's behavior. This is emotional dependency, and many people mistake it for deep love. At first, dependency often feels beautiful. The connection feels intense. The attachment feels meaningful. The closeness feels comforting. The person becomes your emotional safe place. Their presence calms your anxiety. Their affection gives you emotional relief. Their attention makes you feel alive. But slowly, something dangerous begins happening. Instead of adding joy to your life, they become the source of emotional regulation itself. This changes the relationship entirely. Now, when they are distant, your nervous system suffers. When they pull away emotionally, your mind spirals. When they become unavailable, your sense of worth shakes. When they change, your emotional world collapses with them. This is no longer simple love. This is emotional survival attached to another person. Buddhist teaching constantly reminds us that attachment creates suffering because anything outside your direct control can disappear, shift, or transform at any moment. The deeper the dependency becomes, the more unstable inner peace becomes. And most people do not notice this happening gradually. It develops quietly over time. At first, you simply care deeply. Then you begin needing reassurance more often. Then your mood starts depending on their attention. Then your thoughts revolve around them constantly. Then your peace disappears whenever they become emotionally distant. Eventually, your nervous system no longer knows how to self-regulate without external validation. This is why emotional dependency becomes exhausting. The mind becomes hyper-alert constantly, analyzing tone changes, reading messages repeatedly, searching for hidden meanings, watching for emotional shifts, trying to prevent abandonment before it happens. The body stays tense because emotional safety now depends on unpredictable external behavior. This creates chronic anxiety. Many people think they are simply sensitive or loving deeply, but often they are emotionally dependent without realizing it. Their inner stability has slowly been outsourced to another human being. This creates enormous suffering because no person can permanently regulate another person's entire emotional world perfectly. Eventually, disappointment becomes inevitable. No human being can provide constant reassurance forever. No relationship can eliminate insecurity completely. No partner can permanently prevent fear, loneliness, uncertainty, or pain from existing inside another person. And when dependency exists, every imperfection inside the relationship feels emotionally catastrophic. A delayed reply feels threatening. Emotional distance feels terrifying. Small conflicts feel devastating. The mind immediately fears abandonment because peace itself feels unstable without external connection. This is one reason attachment creates so much anxiety. The person is no longer standing emotionally on their own inner ground. They are standing on another person's changing emotions, and emotions are unstable terrain. Buddhist wisdom teaches that true peace cannot depend entirely on unstable conditions. This does not mean relationships are unimportant. It means your entire emotional survival cannot be built around another person's presence without suffering eventually appearing. One of the clearest signs emotional dependency has replaced inner peace is when solitude begins feeling unbearable. A dependent mind often panics in emotional stillness. Without constant connection, reassurance, or attention, emptiness begins surfacing. This emptiness can feel frightening because dependency often distracts people from their deeper relationship with themselves. Many individuals stay emotionally attached not because the relationship is healthy, but because being alone forces them to face unresolved insecurity internally. And so attachment becomes emotional escape. The relationship becomes a shield against loneliness, uncertainty, self-doubt, or inner emptiness. This is why breakups often feel emotionally catastrophic beyond the relationship itself. The person loses not only companionship, but also the external emotional structure regulating their inner world. Suddenly, all the emotions dependency was covering begin surfacing at once. Fear, abandonment, insecurity, restlessness, worthlessness, emptiness. And because the person never fully learned how to sit peacefully with themselves, the suffering feels overwhelming. Buddhism teaches that freedom begins when the mind learns to rest within itself, instead of endlessly searching outside itself for completion. This does not mean isolation, it means emotional grounding. A grounded person can love deeply without collapsing internally whenever circumstances shift. A grounded person appreciates connection without building identity entirely around it. A grounded person experiences loss without losing all inner stability. This balance is rare because modern culture often romanticizes dependency. People are taught that overwhelming attachment equals passion. Emotional obsession gets called soul connection. Constant anxiety gets mistaken for deep love. But true love does not destroy inner peace constantly. Attachment does. This distinction is essential. Love allows breathing. Dependency creates emotional suffocation. Love appreciates another person. Dependency emotionally consumes them. Love coexists with inner stability. Dependency replaces inner stability entirely. One reason emotional dependency becomes so subtle is because it often develops through unmet emotional needs from earlier life experiences. Someone who lacked emotional security growing up may unconsciously search for another person to finally provide permanent emotional safety. The relationship becomes psychologically symbolic. Now, the partner represents validation, protection, belonging, worth, emotional rescue, and once this happens, attachment intensifies enormously because losing the relationship feels like losing emotional survival itself. This explains why some people stay in deeply unhealthy relationships. Even when suffering constantly, they fear leaving because internally the relationship became their emotional anchor. Without it, they feel lost. The Buddha taught that attachment creates illusion, and one of the greatest illusions is believing another person can permanently remove inner suffering for you. Relationships can support healing beautifully. They can offer love, comfort, companionship, and care. But no external person can permanently stabilize an internally ungrounded mind. This realization is painful initially because dependency desperately wants rescue. It wants another person to finally fill every emotional emptiness completely. But this expectation places impossible pressure on relationships. Eventually, resentment, fear, anxiety, and instability begin appearing, because dependency always carries fear underneath it. Fear of losing the source of emotional regulation. This fear often creates controlling behavior unintentionally, clinginess, overthinking, constant reassurance seeking, jealousy, emotional hypervigilance. People experiencing dependency are not trying to be difficult intentionally. Their nervous system simply learned to associate another person with emotional safety itself. And when safety feels threatened, panic appears. Buddhist practice gently interrupts this by teaching awareness of attachment patterns. You begin noticing how often your emotional state depends entirely on another person's behavior. You notice how silence affects your nervous system, You notice how quickly your mood changes based on external validation. You notice how much emotional energy goes toward maintaining connection instead of cultivating inner stability. This awareness is not meant to create shame, it creates freedom. Because once dependency becomes visible, healing becomes possible. Many people never realize how disconnected they became from themselves during emotionally dependent relationships. Their hobbies disappeared, their inner life weakened, their self-trust faded, their emotional focus revolved almost entirely around another person. Slowly, their relationship with themselves became neglected, and this neglect creates suffering. Because inner peace requires inner relationship. You cannot abandon yourself emotionally for years and still feel deeply grounded internally. This is why Buddhist wisdom places such deep importance on returning attention inward, not selfishly, not narcissistically, but consciously. You begin rebuilding your relationship with your own mind, body, emotions, and presence. You begin learning how to soothe yourself instead of constantly needing external regulation. You begin rediscovering your own emotional center. At first, this can feel deeply uncomfortable. A dependent nervous system is accustomed to looking outward for stability. Sitting alone with yourself may initially feel empty, restless, or emotionally raw. But slowly, through awareness and presence, something beautiful begins happening. The nervous system starts learning safety internally again. This changes everything. Now, peace no longer disappears every time another person changes emotionally. Now, solitude becomes restful instead of terrifying. Now, self-worth becomes less dependent on external attention. Now, relationships become connection instead of emotional survival systems. This transformation takes patience because dependency patterns often run deep. The mind still reaches outward automatically sometimes. It still wants reassurance. It still fears abandonment occasionally, but gradually, awareness becomes stronger than emotional habit. You stop collapsing internally every time someone becomes distant. You stop measuring your value through constant validation. You stop needing another person to emotionally complete you before feeling worthy of life. And with this shift, relationships become healthier naturally, because now love is no longer fueled entirely by fear. Fear had distorted everything before. Fear made attachment feel urgent. Fear made silence feel threatening. Fear made distance feel catastrophic. But when inner peace slowly returns, relationships stop carrying the impossible burden of being your entire emotional foundation. This creates spaciousness, breathing room, emotional freedom. Now, love can exist without constant panic underneath it. This is one reason Buddhism emphasizes self-awareness so deeply. Without awareness, people unconsciously hand their emotional authority away constantly. Their mood becomes externally controlled. Their identity becomes externally shaped. Their peace becomes externally dependent. And this creates endless instability because life itself cannot guarantee permanence. The more deeply you attach your survival to changing external conditions, the more fragile your emotional world becomes. But once peace begins growing internally, something profound changes. You still love deeply, you still care deeply, you still connect sincerely, but your existence no longer collapses every time another person changes emotionally. This is freedom, not coldness, not detachment from human connection. Freedom from emotional slavery to external validation. One of the deepest Buddhist truths is that suffering decreases when attachment loosens. Emotional dependency is attachment intensified into emotional necessity. The dependent mind says, "I need you to feel okay." The peaceful mind says, "I appreciate you deeply, but my existence does not disappear without you." This difference may sound subtle, but it transforms relationships completely. One creates fear-based attachment, the other creates grounded connection. Many people never experienced grounded connection before because dependency was normalized in their emotional history. They confuse emotional chaos with intimacy because chaos feels familiar. But true peace feels very different. Peace is steady, calm, spacious, breathable. It allows individuality. It allows silence. It allows change without immediate collapse. This is why healing emotional dependency often feels unfamiliar initially. The nervous system was trained toward intensity and reassurance seeking. Inner peace may even feel emotionally boring at first. But eventually, calmness becomes deeply nourishing. The body relaxes, the mind quiets, the heart softens, and the person begins experiencing life beyond constant emotional survival mode. This is where true healing deepens, not because relationships stop mattering, but because relationships stop replacing your relationship with yourself. The Buddha never taught isolation from human love. He taught freedom from clinging. There is a profound difference. Clinging says, "Without you, I am nothing." Love says, "I cherish your presence while still remaining connected to myself." Clinging creates fear constantly. Love allows peace. And eventually, after enough awareness, suffering, reflection, and inner work, another truth quietly settles inside the heart. The peace you were searching for through another person was always something your own spirit needed to relearn within itself. Not because human connection is meaningless, but because no external love can permanently replace inner grounding. This realization is deeply liberating, because now your peace no longer depends entirely on uncertain conditions. Now your worth no longer rises and falls through another person's attention. Now your nervous system slowly learns that safety can exist even in solitude. And perhaps for the first time in a very long time, you begin feeling something that attachment had quietly stolen from you for years. A calm relationship with your own existence. And once you begin feeling a calm relationship with your own existence, another truth becomes easier to understand. The suffering was never only about loving someone. It was about asking something temporary to become permanent. It was about holding a passing moment as if it owed you forever. It was about placing your peace inside hands that life itself was always capable of opening. This is where Buddhist wisdom becomes painfully clear. You suffer more deeply when you demand permanence from what was never built to stay unchanged. There is a quiet ache that comes when the heart wants life to freeze a beautiful moment and keep it untouched forever. A person enters your life, and suddenly you want their affection to remain the same. A season feels warm, and you want it to last. A relationship gives you meaning, and you begin believing it should never change. But life does not ask our permission before it moves. It changes anyway. This is one of the hardest truths to accept, because the heart naturally wants security. It wants to know who will stay, what will last, and where it can rest without fear. But Buddhism teaches that everything formed by conditions is impermanent. Every meeting depends on conditions. Every relationship depends on conditions. Every feeling depends on conditions. Every chapter depends on conditions. And when those conditions change, the form also changes. This does not mean love is fake. It means love is alive. And because it is alive, it moves. A flower is not false because it fades. A sunset is not meaningless because it disappears. A season is not worthless because it ends. In the same way, a person was not meaningless because they changed. A relationship was not unreal because it ended. A moment was not empty because it could not last forever. But attachment does not understand this. Attachment says, if it mattered, it should stay. Wisdom says, it mattered, and still it was temporary. That one difference can change your whole life. Grasping begins when the heart tries to hold life still. It is not just loving someone. It is demanding that they remain the version of themselves your heart first trusted. It is not just enjoying a moment. It is refusing to let the moment pass. It is not just remembering the past. It is trying to live there again, even after life has moved on. And the tighter you grasp, the more painful change becomes. This is why suffering often grows after beautiful experiences. The beauty itself is not the problem. The problem is the demand that beauty must remain unchanged. The mind tastes joy, then immediately becomes afraid of losing it. It receives love, then begins fearing abandonment. It feels closeness, then begins trying to control the future. So even in happiness, attachment plants fear. This is one of the deepest reasons people suffer in relationships. They are not only experiencing love, they are trying to secure love against impermanence. They want guarantees from another human being who is also changing, growing, wounded, uncertain, and temporary. They want certainty from life, but life keeps speaking in movement. Buddhist wisdom does not say this to make the heart cold. It says this to make the heart honest. Because when you understand impermanence, you stop treating change as betrayal. You stop acting as if every ending means life was cruel to you. You stop believing that because someone changed, your whole life has been robbed of meaning. You begin seeing that change is not a mistake in life. Change is the nature of life. People change because they are not fixed objects. They are living beings with fears, desires, wounds, confusion, growth, weakness, and choices. The person who once held you close may later become distant. The person who once understood you may later misunderstand you. The person who once promised forever may later discover they cannot remain. This hurts, but it is not outside the law of life. The pain becomes deeper when the mind says, they were not supposed to change. But everything changes. The body changes. The mind changes. Feelings change. Priorities change. Needs change. Even the self you are defending today is not the same self you were years ago. You are also impermanent. This is important because attachment often makes us see only other people's changes as painful. We forget that we too are constantly becoming someone new. The things that once comforted you may no longer comfort you. The dreams you once chased may no longer fit you. The people you once needed may no longer belong to your path. Life is not only taking things from you, it is also moving you forward, even when the movement hurts. Grasping resists this movement. It says, no, stay here, stay this way, stay mine, stay familiar. But life cannot obey that demand. And every time reality refuses to obey attachment, suffering appears. This is why the Buddha placed so much emphasis on seeing clearly. Clear seeing means looking at a person, a moment, or a relationship without demanding that it become permanent before you allow yourself to feel peace. Clear seeing says, this is here now, and I will meet it with presence. Attachment says, this must stay or I cannot be okay. One creates gratitude, the other creates fear. When you grasp at temporary people, you stop truly meeting them. You begin managing them. You monitor their tone. You watch their behavior. You fear their silence. You try to predict their feelings. You become less present with them because you are too busy trying to protect yourself from losing them. This is how attachment quietly steals the joy it is trying to preserve. You may be with someone physically, but mentally you are already afraid of the day they may leave. You may be inside a beautiful season, but emotionally you are already anxious about its ending. You may receive love, but instead of resting in it, the mind begins asking, how long will this last? So the moment is never fully lived. It is only guarded. And what is guarded with fear cannot be enjoyed with freedom. Buddhist wisdom invites a different way. It teaches you to love what is present without trying to possess it, to appreciate what is here without pretending it belongs to you forever, to hold life with an open hand, not because you care less, but because you understand more. An open hand can receive, a closed fist can only strain. This does not mean you never commit. It does not mean you stop caring. It does not mean you become careless with relationships. It means you stop building your peace on the impossible belief that nothing will ever change. Real love becomes deeper when it accepts impermanence, because then every moment becomes precious, not guaranteed. Every conversation becomes something to meet fully, not something to control. Every person becomes someone to honor, not someone to own. Ownership creates fear. Presence creates tenderness. The mind suffers because it turns living things into possessions. It says, my person, my future, my plan, my version of how life should be. But life does not belong to the mind. Life flows. And when you try to own what flows, you suffer. This is why some people cannot release relationships even after they have clearly ended. They are not only missing the person, they are resisting impermanence. They are arguing with the natural movement of life. They are saying, this was supposed to stay. But the fact that it changed means it was never fully under your control. This truth can feel devastating at first, but it can also become liberating, because if it was never fully under your control, then you do not have to keep blaming yourself for not keeping it alive forever. You do not have to keep thinking you failed because something changed. You do not have to keep punishing yourself because a temporary chapter did not become a permanent home. Some things end because their conditions ended. That is all. Not because you were worthless. Not because the entire experience was false. Not because life is against you. Sometimes the conditions that held something together dissolve, and the form dissolves with them. This is how life works. A relationship needs trust, timing, emotional readiness, shared values, effort, honesty, and mutual presence. When those conditions weaken or disappear, the relationship changes. The same is true for friendships, dreams, identities, and seasons of life. Nothing stands alone. Everything depends on causes and conditions. This Buddhist understanding is powerful because it reduces personal suffering. Instead of saying, this ended because I am not enough, you begin seeing more clearly. You see conditions, you see causes, you see patterns, you see that many things were involved. This does not remove sadness, but it removes unnecessary self-torture. You stop turning impermanence into personal rejection. This is where many people suffer deeply. They believe every ending is a statement about their worth. Someone leaves, and they think, I was not enough. A friendship fades, and they think, I am easy to forget. A dream collapses, and they think, my life is ruined. But impermanence is not always a verdict against you. Sometimes it is simply life-changing shape, and life is always changing shape. The child becomes an adult. The strong body becomes tired. The fresh face grows lines. The full house becomes quiet. The exciting beginning becomes an ordinary middle. The passionate connection becomes a test of maturity. The season that once felt endless becomes memory. Nothing stays untouched. When you understand this, you begin holding life differently. You stop demanding that every good thing save you forever. You stop expecting people to remain frozen in the version that made you feel safe. You stop treating change as an enemy. You begin learning how to bow to life without collapsing every time it moves. This bowing is not defeat. It is wisdom. It is the heart saying, I do not control the river, but I can learn how to stop drowning in my resistance to it. Grasping makes you drown because it turns every wave into a personal attack, but acceptance teaches you to float. It does not remove the waves, it changes your relationship with them. This matters deeply in love. If you love with grasping, you become afraid. If you love with awareness, you become present. Grasping says, "Do not change, because I need you to keep me safe." Awareness says, "You are here now, and I will meet you honestly while you are here." This does not mean tolerating harm. This does not mean staying where you are wounded. Accepting impermanence does not mean accepting disrespect. It means recognizing change clearly and responding with wisdom instead of clinging. Sometimes impermanence means a relationship has grown deeper. Sometimes it means a relationship has ended. Sometimes it means a person no longer belongs close to your life. Sometimes it means your own heart has changed and can no longer live in old places. Wisdom knows how to listen. Attachment only knows how to grab. The pain of grasping also appears when people try to keep old versions of themselves alive. They cling to who they were before the heartbreak, before the betrayal, before the disappointment, before life changed them. They say, "I want the old me back." But sometimes the old you is not coming back in the same form. A wiser you is trying to emerge. This is also impermanence. You are not meant to remain unchanged by life. Pain changes you. Love changes you. Loss changes you. Silence changes you. Healing changes you. The goal is not to return to who you were before the wound. The goal is to become someone who can carry wisdom without becoming hardened. But grasping resists this too. It wants the old innocence, the old trust, the old simplicity, the old version of life before everything became complicated. And while this longing is understandable, it can trap you in another kind of suffering, because you begin rejecting the person you are becoming simply because you are attached to who you used to be. Buddhist wisdom teaches that there is no fixed self to recover. There is only awareness moving through change. This can sound unsettling at first, but it is deeply freeing. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to become new. You are allowed to stop forcing yourself back into an old identity that no longer fits. The past version of you deserves compassion, not imprisonment. Let that version be honored. Let that version be thanked. Let that version rest. But do not force your whole life to remain loyal to who you were before you learned what you now know. This is why impermanence is not only about losing others. It is also about releasing old selves, old dreams, old beliefs, and old emotional homes. Life constantly asks for inner renewal. Suffering grows when we refuse that renewal. A person may keep saying, "This is not how my life was supposed to be," and maybe it is not how they planned it. But hidden inside that sentence is a demand that life should have obeyed an old idea forever. When life does not match the old picture, they feel punished. But sometimes the old picture was too small for the life that is still unfolding. This does not make pain easy. It simply means the ending is not always the end of meaning. Sometimes the collapse of what you wanted creates space for something truer, though the heart may not see it immediately. This is why the Buddhist path asks for patience, not passive. Waiting, but patient seeing. You do not need to rush your grief. You do not need to pretend you are peaceful. You only need to begin noticing where your suffering is made worse by grasping. Notice where you are demanding permanence. Notice where you are arguing with change. Notice where you are holding a person, memory, or identity so tightly that your own spirit cannot breathe. This noticing begins the release, not all at once, not perfectly, but gently. The mind may still cling, the heart may still ache, the body may still miss what was familiar, but each moment of awareness creates a little space between you and the grasping. In that space, suffering begins to soften. You may still love what ended. You may still miss what changed. You may still grieve what passed. But you no longer have to demand that life reverse itself before you allow peace to enter. This is the shift. Peace does not come when everything becomes permanent. Peace comes when you stop asking temporary things to carry permanent emotional responsibility. No person can promise to never change in any way. No moment can remain untouched forever. No season can stay open endlessly. No identity can remain fixed across an entire life. Everything moves. And when you stop treating movement as betrayal, the heart becomes less afraid of living. There is tenderness in this. Because once you understand impermanence, gratitude becomes deeper. You begin appreciating moments while they are here. You begin speaking with more honesty. You begin loving with more presence. You begin forgiving life for not staying still. You stop postponing appreciation. You stop assuming you own tomorrow. You stop taking the present for granted. Impermanence, when understood deeply, does not make life empty. It makes life sacred. Because everything is passing, everything matters. Because nothing is guaranteed, presence becomes precious. Because people change, love must be awake. Attachment sleeps through life because it is busy trying to possess it. Awareness wakes up and finally sees what is here. This is why Buddhist wisdom can feel both painful and beautiful. It takes away the illusion of permanence, but gives back the gift of presence. It removes false security, but offers deeper peace. It teaches that you cannot keep everything, but you can meet everything more fully while it is here. And maybe that is the heart of letting go, not throwing life away, not becoming cold, not refusing love, but learning to touch life without trying to trap it, learning to receive without demanding ownership, learning to release without believing release means failure. The more you practice this, the more life becomes lighter. Endings still hurt, but they do not destroy your entire identity. Change still challenges you, but it does not feel like personal betrayal every time. Loss still brings grief, but grief no longer becomes a permanent prison. You begin trusting yourself to meet change. That trust is powerful, because the real fear beneath grasping is not only losing others, it is the fear that you will not survive what changes. But you have survived change before. You have lived through endings. You have adapted to new seasons. You have become new many times, even when you thought you could not. You are more fluid than your fear admits. The heart can break and still open again. The mind can grieve and still learn peace again. The self can lose an old form and still become something wiser. This is the quiet miracle hidden inside impermanence. Life takes forms away, but it also creates new ones. It closes chapters, but it also creates blank pages. It removes what you clung to, but it also reveals where you were still depending on illusion. And slowly, the heart begins to understand. You do not suffer only because things change. You suffer because you demand that changing things remain fixed. You do not suffer only because people leave. You suffer because attachment says they were never allowed to. You do not suffer only because moments pass. You suffer because the mind tries to make passing moments permanent homes. But once grasping softens, life becomes less of a battlefield. You stop fighting the river. You stop begging the seasons to reverse. You stop turning temporary people into permanent emotional shelters. And somewhere inside that release, you find a peace that does not depend on stopping change. A peace that can breathe while life moves. A peace that can love without owning. A peace that can grieve without clinging. A peace that can say, "This was beautiful, this mattered, and still I allow it to pass." That is not weakness. That is one of the deepest freedoms the heart can learn.